The chandeliers of Thornwood Park burned cold that winter evening, their light sharp enough to cut shadows but too sterile to offer warmth. Duke Alaric Viramont stood at the head of the grand dining hall, his silhouette carved against the towering windows that framed a landscape of frozen gardens and skeletal trees. His presence did not fill the room. It crushed it. Servants moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs worth more than their lifetimes, their eyes trained on the floor as if meeting his gaze might turn them to stone. He was not a man who commanded respect through warmth or charisma. He commanded it through the unspoken certainty that disobedience would be met with consequences swift and absolute. This was a house ruled by iron precision, where every breath was measured, every word calculated, and every moment existed under the weight of his judgment. Into this suffocating order had come Elowen Hart, a woman of no title, no fortune, no power. Yet her presence disturbed the air like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples no one could quite name. And tonight, as the Duke watched her from across the hall, her quiet defiance glowing like embers in her steady gaze, he felt something he had long buried stir beneath the armor of his control. This is the story of a man who believed dominance was survival, and the woman who forced him to question everything he had built. Stay with me until the end, drop a comment with the city you are watching from, and let me know if you see what I see, because this tale does not follow the rules you expect. Hit that like button if you are ready for something raw, something real, something that will leave you breathless. The estate stretched across 2,000 acres of English countryside, a monument to centuries of Viramont supremacy. Thornwood Park was not merely a residence, it was a statement. Its limestone facade rose 4 stories high, crowned with battlements that had once withstood sieges during the Wars of the Roses. Now they stood as relics of a power that no longer needed swords to enforce itself. The Duke required only his name, his reputation, and the glacial precision with which he dismantled anyone foolish enough to challenge him. Alaric Viramont was 42 years old, though his face carried the weight of a man who had lived twice that. Battle scars traced his jaw and temple. Faint silver lines earned in conflicts the crown preferred not to acknowledge publicly. He had served as a colonel in wars that newspapers described in euphemisms, peacekeeping operations, strategic interventions. Men who fought beside him spoke of his tactical brilliance in whispers, the way a surgeon might admire a scalpel's edge. He did not flinch. He did not hesitate. When orders came to hold a position, he held it, even when the cost was measured in lives. When diplomacy failed and messier solutions became necessary, Alaric was the man they called. He returned home decorated and hollow. His marriage to Lady Catherine Ashford had been arranged when he was 23, a union designed to merge 2 of England's most powerful families. She had been beautiful in the way porcelain dolls are beautiful, flawless, fragile, and ultimately lifeless. They produced no heirs. She died of pneumonia in the 3rd year of their marriage, and Alaric attended her funeral with the same stoic composure he brought to strategy meetings. The estate whispered that he had not wept. He had simply returned to his study, poured a single glass of brandy, and continued reviewing ledgers as if nothing had changed. Perhaps nothing had. In the years since, he had become a machine of efficiency. Thornwood Park ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. Servants were hired and dismissed based on performance metrics. Tenants paid rent to the penny or faced eviction. Every social engagement, every political maneuver, every conversation was executed with surgical intent. Alaric did not believe in waste, not of time, not of resources, not of emotion. Sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, a weakness that enemies exploited. He had seen what happened to men who let their guard down, who trusted the wrong person, who allowed affection to cloud judgment. They ended up ruined or dead. So he built walls of protocol, of reputation, of carefully curated isolation. And for nearly 2 decades, those walls held, until Elowen Hart. She had arrived 6 months prior, brought in as a companion to his elderly aunt, Lady Marguerite Viramont, who resided in the estate's east wing. The arrangement had been made through an agency in London, and Alaric had approved it with barely a glance at the paperwork. Companions were interchangeable. They read aloud, poured tea, provided the illusion of company for aging relatives too proud to admit loneliness. He expected Elowen to be like the others, timid, deferential, invisible. She was none of those things. The first time he truly noticed her was during a dinner party 3 months into her employment. The event had been a calculated affair, designed to solidify alliances with several members of Parliament whose support Alaric needed for a railway expansion project. 20 guests sat around the mahogany table, their conversation a careful dance of veiled insults and strategic compliments. Elowen had been seated near the far end, present only because Lady Marguerite insisted her companion join them. She wore a simple gray dress, her dark hair pinned back without ornament, and she said nothing for the first 4 courses. Then Lord Pemberton, a bloated aristocrat whose fortune came from inherited coal mines, made a comment about the working poor. "They breed like rabbits," Pemberton had said, gesturing with his wine glass. "No sense of restraint, no understanding of their place. If they would simply accept their lot instead of agitating for reforms, society would function far more smoothly." The table murmured agreement. These were men who measured worth in titles and land, who viewed labor as a commodity to be managed, not humanity to be acknowledged. Elowen set down her fork. The small clink of silver against porcelain somehow cut through the murmurs. "Forgive me, Lord Pemberton," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "But have you ever considered that breeding like rabbits, as you put it, might be the only rational response to a system that works them to death before they reach 40? The table fell silent. Pemberton's face flushed crimson. "I beg your pardon?" She met his gaze without flinching. "You speak of restraint as if poverty were a moral failing rather than a structural inevitability. When a man works 14 hours in your mines and still cannot afford to feed his children, additional children become both labor and insurance. It is not ignorance, Lord Pemberton. It is adaptation to the conditions you impose." Alaric's hand had frozen halfway to his glass. He watched her with the detached fascination one might reserve for a newly discovered species. Dangerous, unpredictable, utterly captivating. Pemberton sputtered, "Young lady, you clearly do not understand the complexities of—" "I understand that complexity is often a word employed to obscure cruelty," Elowen interrupted. Her tone remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the statement more devastating. "I also understand that this conversation makes you uncomfortable, so I will return to silence. Please, continue enjoying your roast." She picked up her fork and resumed eating as if she had commented on the weather. The dinner limped forward, but the damage was done. After the guests departed, Alaric summoned her to his study. She entered without knocking, which was the first violation of protocol. She did not curtsy, which was the second. She simply stood before his desk, hands folded, and waited. He studied her for a long moment. In the lamplight, her features revealed themselves more clearly. High cheekbones, a stubborn jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but arresting, intelligent, unafraid. "You embarrass Lord Pemberton," Alaric said finally. "Yes," she replied. "He is a powerful man. His support is valuable. Then perhaps he should support ideas that can withstand scrutiny." Alaric leaned back in his chair. "Do you have any concept of the alliances you jeopardized tonight? Do you have any concept of the lives ground to dust to maintain those alliances?" He should have dismissed her then. Should have sent her packing with a cold reference and a warning to future employers. Instead, he found himself asking, "Why are you here, Miss Hart?" She tilted her head slightly. "Here in this room or here at Thornwood Park?" "Both. I am here in this room because you summoned me. I am here at Thornwood Park because I needed employment and your aunt needed a companion. Beyond that, I suspect you are asking why I spoke tonight when silence would have been safer. The answer is that I find safety overrated when purchased with complicity." Alaric rose from his desk and walked to the window. The ground stretched dark and endless beyond the glass, a kingdom he controlled through will and reputation. "You do not strike me as naive, Miss Hart. You must know that idealism without power is simply noise." "Perhaps," she said. "But power without conscience is simply tyranny." He turned to face her. "And you believe you have a conscience worth asserting?" "I believe everyone does. Whether they choose to listen is another matter." They stood in silence, the distance between them charged with something Alaric could not name. It was not attraction. He had long ago severed that capacity. It was not admiration. Her insolence bordered on insubordination. It was recognition. The uncomfortable sensation of meeting someone who refused to play the game by his rules. "You will not speak out of turn at my table again," he said, his voice low and final. "Of course not, Your Grace." She met his eyes. "I will simply ensure my turns are more frequent." She left before he could respond. That night, Alaric stood in his study until dawn, staring at nothing, feeling the first hairline crack in walls he had believed impenetrable. The weeks that followed were a study in controlled chaos. Elowen did not change her behavior, but she became more strategic in its deployment. She attended dinners when required, spoke when spoken to, and somehow managed to inject precisely calibrated doses of disruption into every interaction. A comment about labor conditions here, a question about wealth distribution there. Never enough to cause scandal, always enough to make the room uncomfortable. Alaric found himself watching her. Not openly, he was too disciplined for that. But his awareness of her presence grew like a tumor, silent, invasive, impossible to ignore. He noticed the way she moved through rooms, economical and purposeful, wasting no motion. He noticed the way servants relaxed fractionally when she passed, as if her lack of pretension gave them permission to breathe. He noticed the books she borrowed from the library, political philosophy, economic theory, histories of revolutions. She was educating herself, sharpening weapons he could not confiscate. Lady Marguerite, his aunt, adored her. The old woman had grown sharper in Elowen's company, their conversations ranging from art to politics to the scandalous inadequacies of modern society. Alaric would sometimes pause outside Marguerite's sitting room, listening to their laughter, genuine, unguarded, human. It was a sound Thornwood Park had not heard in decades. He told himself his interest was purely strategic. Elowen Hart was an anomaly, and anomalies required study. If she posed a threat to the estate's order, he needed to understand her. If she could be useful, he needed to determine how. Emotion did not enter the equation. Emotion was irrelevant. But then came the incident with the stable boy. Thomas was 15, the son of one of the groundskeepers, and he had been caught stealing food from the kitchen. The head butler, Mr. Graves, brought the matter to Alaric's attention with the expectation of standard punishment, dismissal of both the boy and his father, public humiliation to discourage future theft. Thornwood Park did not tolerate dishonesty. Precedent was clear. Alaric was reviewing the case in his study when Elowen knocked. Actually knocked, this time. "Enter," he said. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I understand you are considering dismissing Thomas Kelly and his father." "You understand correctly. May I ask why?" Alaric set down his pen. "He stole from the estate. The reason is self-evident. He took bread," Elowen said. "3 loaves over the course of a week. His mother is ill. His father's wages, which you control, are insufficient to cover both rent on the cottage you lease to them and the cost of feeding a family of 6 while paying for medicine. Theft is theft, Miss Hart. If I excuse it for sympathetic circumstances, I invite chaos. Every servant with a sob story will believe rules do not apply to them." She walked to his desk, her movements controlled but radiating intensity. "You speak of chaos as if compassion were its progenitor. But I have seen what true chaos looks like, Your Grace. It is not a fed child. It is a desperate one. It is a father so broken by fear of losing employment that he watches his family starve rather than risk asking for help. That is the chaos your system creates. My system, as you call it, keeps this estate functional. It employs over 200 people. It sustains tenant farmers, local businesses, an entire community. Without discipline, it collapses. Without humanity, it is already collapsed. You are simply ruling over a corpse." Alaric stood, his hands flat on the desk. "You overstep, Miss Hart." "Then dismiss me," she shot back. "Add me to the list of people sacrificed to maintain your precious order. But before you do, ask yourself what you are actually preserving. Is it the estate? Or is it simply the illusion that control can substitute for connection?" They stood face to face across the expanse of mahogany, the air between them crackling. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice dangerous and quiet. "Give the boy a medal? Throw open the storerooms and invite the countryside to help themselves? I would have you recognize that power used only to punish is not power at all. It is cowardice dressed in authority." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Get out. Not until you answer my question. What will you do about Thomas?" He could have her forcibly removed, could end this conversation with a word. Instead, he heard himself say, "The boy will be reassigned to the stables under supervision. His father's wages will be reviewed. The bread will be deducted from my personal household account, not theirs. Is that sufficient, Miss Hart?" She searched his face for a long moment. "It is a beginning." "Then consider this conversation concluded. She turned to leave, paused at the door. Your Grace? Thank you. The door closed softly. Alaric stood alone in his study, pulse elevated, mind churning. He had just allowed a woman with no rank, no authority, no claim on his attention to extract a concession through sheer force of will. It was unacceptable. It was unprecedented. It was exhilarating. That night, he did something he had not done in years. He poured himself a second glass of brandy, sat by the fire, and allowed himself to think about Elowen Hart not as a problem to be managed, but as a woman he wanted to understand. The realization settled over him like a shroud. Want was a word he had excised from his vocabulary. Need was something he controlled through discipline. Desire was a weakness he could not afford. But there it was, undeniable and growing, a hunger that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul he had spent decades convincing himself he no longer possessed. Winter deepened. London's political season approached, and with it came pressures Alaric could no longer defer. His solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, arrived with documents and uncomfortable truths. They met in the library, a room lined floor to ceiling with volumes Alaric had read and volumes that existed purely for show. Pembroke was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanor of someone perpetually delivering bad news. Your Grace, the matter of succession must be addressed. The documents were spread across the reading table. Genealogies, estate planning, political maps. You are the last direct male heir. Without issue, Thornwood Park and the Veermont title revert to a distant cousin whose politics are, shall we say, problematic. Define problematic. He is a reformist, sympathetic to labor movements, hostile to traditional land ownership structures. If he inherits, he will likely break up the estate, sell parcels to tenant farmers at reduced rates, and generally dismantle everything your family has built. Alaric studied the documents without expression. And your proposed solution? Marriage. To a woman of appropriate station, with the expectation of producing heirs. There are several candidates. No. Pembroke blinked. Your Grace. I said no. I will not be paraded through drawing rooms like livestock at auction. With respect, this is not about personal preference. This is about preserving a legacy. The Veermont name has held power for 4 centuries. That ends with you unless action is taken. Then it ends with me. Pembroke removed his spectacles, polished them with a handkerchief. May I speak plainly? You are my solicitor. Candor is your function. You are committing slow suicide out of spite. I do not know what happened to you in those wars, what you saw or did, but I know it broke something. And rather than repair it, you have built an empire of isolation. You control everything except yourself. Marriage is not a concession, Your Grace. It is an opportunity. A chance to be something more than the sum of your scars. Alaric's voice dropped to a lethal quiet. You forget yourself, Pembroke. No, Your Grace. You forget yourself. You forget that power is meaningless without purpose. You have made yourself indispensable to hundreds of people, yet you remain utterly alone. That is not strength. That is tragedy. The silence stretched. Finally, Alaric said, Prepare a list of candidates. I will review it, but I make no promises. Pembroke gathered his documents. That is all I ask. After the solicitor departed, Alaric remained in the library staring at the fire. Marriage. The word felt like ash in his mouth. He had tried it once, and it had been a hollow pantomime of partnership. Catherine had been dutiful, beautiful, and entirely absent as a human being. They had shared a bed, a home, a name, but never a thought, never a truth, never a moment of genuine connection. He would rather die alone than repeat that performance. But the estate was a living thing. It required stewardship beyond his own lifespan. Tenants depended on it. Employees relied on it. To let it fall into chaos because of personal distaste was, as Pembroke said, suicide by negligence. He rose and walked to the window. Below, in the gardens, he saw a figure moving along the frozen paths. Elowen, wrapped in a dark cloak, her breath misting in the cold air. She walked alone, as she often did, and there was something about her solitude that mirrored his own. Not loneliness, but a deliberate choosing of space over shallow company. And in that moment, Alaric understood the dangerous shape his thoughts had taken. He wanted her, not as a companion, not as a disruption, but as an equal, a partner. someone who could stand in this suffocating world and still breathe freely. It was impossible. She was impossibly beneath his station, impossibly inappropriate, impossibly everything his world would reject. And yet the impossibility only sharpened the want, made it real in a way nothing else had been for years. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. This was madness. This was weakness. This was everything he had sworn to destroy in himself. And yet, what? The list of marriage candidates arrived 2 weeks later. 12 women, all from impeccable families, all suitable in every measurable way. Alaric reviewed their profiles with the clinical detachment of a man purchasing livestock. Lady Victoria Ashcroft, beautiful, accomplished, politically connected. Miss Arabella Thornton, wealthy, cultured, known for her charity work. Lady Penelope Warwick, young, fertile, desperate to escape a domineering mother. None of them were Elowen. He set the list aside and summoned his valet. "I'm going riding." The stableman was surprised to see him. The Duke rarely rode for pleasure, only for practicality, but today he took his black stallion, Hades, and rode hard across the estate's frozen fields until both man and beast were heaving. The cold air scoured his lungs, the speed blurred thought, and for a brief window he felt something other than the crushing weight of duty. When he returned, Elowen was in the courtyard, speaking with Thomas, the stable boy. The boy was laughing at something she said, his face lit with an ease Alaric had never seen in any servant who addressed him. Elowen noticed the Duke's approach and straightened, but she did not flee. "Your Grace," she said. "A fine ride?" Alaric dismounted, handed the reins to a groom. "Adequate." She smiled slightly. "High praise, coming from you." Thomas, sensing the shift in atmosphere, bowed quickly. "I will see to the stallion, Your Grace." He fled. They stood alone in the courtyard, frost crunching under their feet. Alaric studied her openly now, no longer bothering to hide his interest. She met his gaze without flinching, waiting. "Why did you come here, Miss Hart?" he asked again, the question that had haunted him since that first dinner. "I told you I needed employment. That is a fact, not a truth." She considered him. "You want to know why someone with my education and opinions would choose to serve in the house of a man whose values I find questionable?" "Yes, because proximity is power," she said simply. "I could shout my beliefs from a London street corner and change nothing. Or I could whisper them in the ears of people who shape policy, who control resources, who make decisions. I could plant seeds in soil that might actually yield fruit. Your aunt understands this. I suspect on some level you do as well. So you are here to change me?" "No, Your Grace. I am here to survive. If that survival requires occasionally challenging men who have forgotten their humanity, so be it. But I have no illusions about my capacity to change anyone who does not wish to be changed. And if I wish to be changed." The question hung between them, dangerous and raw. Elowen's expression softened, just slightly. "Then I would say you already are. And the question is whether you will accept it or spend the rest of your life fighting ghosts." Before he could respond, the head butler appeared at the entrance. "Your Grace, Lord Pemberton is here to see you. He insists the matter is urgent." Alaric cursed inwardly. Of course it was. The railway vote was approaching, and Pemberton's support was critical. He looked at Elowen. "We will continue this conversation." She inclined her head. "I look forward to it." He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the estate's corridors, and felt the walls he had built beginning to fracture in earnest. Inside, Lord Pemberton waited in the drawing room, his bulk overflowing a chair designed for more moderate men. "Alaric," he boomed, "we need to discuss your position on the labor amendment." Alaric poured himself a whiskey. "My position has not changed. It needs to." Pemberton leaned forward, his jowls quivering. "That damned companion of yours has been spreading ideas. My wife attended tea with your aunt last week, and apparently Miss Hart gave quite the lecture on worker safety regulations. Now Victoria is haranguing me about conditions in the mines. It is intolerable. Then perhaps you should improve conditions in your mines." Pemberton's face darkened. "This is not a joke. That woman is poison. She undermines the natural order, fills women's heads with dangerous notions. You need to dismiss her immediately." Alaric set his glass down with deliberate calm. "Miss Hart is employed by my aunt, not by me. Her retention or dismissal is not your concern. Everything that happens in this house is my concern when it affects my interests. I am not alone in this, Alaric. Others have noticed. There is talk. What sort of talk? That you are bewitched, that she has some unnatural influence over you, that the great Duke of Thornwood is losing his grip. Alaric smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Tell me, Pemberton, when have I ever given a damn what people say? When they're saying it costs you votes. The railway expansion requires unanimous support from our coalition. If you alienate allies over some lowborn agitator, choose your next words carefully. Pemberton swallowed but pressed on. She is beneath you in every conceivable way. Marrying her would be catastrophic. And do not tell me you have not considered it. I see how you look at her. Alaric stood. This conversation is over. See yourself out. Damn it, man, be reasonable. Pemberton rose as well, his voice rising. You cannot throw away everything for a woman you cannot even introduce in proper society without inviting ridicule. I do not recall asking your permission. Then you are a fool. A dangerous, deluded fool. And when this inevitably destroys you, do not expect sympathy from those of us who warned you. Pemberton stormed out, slamming doors in his wake. Alaric remained standing, his hands clenched, his mind racing. The confrontation had clarified one thing. The world he inhabited would never accept what he wanted. The aristocracy, the alliances, the carefully maintained structures of power, all of it rested on conformity, on maintaining lines that had been drawn centuries ago. Elowen Hart obliterated those lines simply by existing, and Alaric Viermont, Duke of Thornwood, a man who had spent his entire life enforcing rules, suddenly understood that the only rule that mattered was the one he made for himself. That night he found her in the library. She was reading by lamplight, curled in one of the high-backed chairs, looking more at home among the books than anyone he had ever seen. She glanced up as he entered. Your Grace, I assumed you would be occupied with Lord Pemberton's tantrum. He sat across from her. You heard. The entire West Wing heard. He has a remarkable capacity for volume. He came to demand your dismissal. And what did you tell him? That it was none of his concern. Alaric leaned back. He also accused me of being bewitched by you. Elowen closed her book. Are you? The question was direct, unflinching. Alaric met her eyes. I do not believe in witchcraft, Miss Hart, but I do believe you have disrupted something I thought permanent. Whether that is magic or simply honesty, I cannot say. Why are you telling me this? Because I am tired of pretending. Because every conversation I've had today has been theater, performance, strategy. And I find I crave one moment of truth before I return to the stage. She set the book aside. What truth do you want, Your Grace? He hesitated, then plunged forward. I am being pressured to marry, to produce heirs, secure alliances, fulfill duties I have deferred too long. There is a list of appropriate women, each more suitable than the last, and I find I cannot bring myself to care about any of them. So do not marry. It is not that simple. Without an heir, the estate falls to someone who will destroy it. Hundreds of people depend on Thornwood Park. I cannot abandon them because of personal distaste. Then marry for duty. You have done harder things. I have. But I find I am no longer willing to accept hardship as inevitable. He leaned forward. You asked me once if I had a conscience worth asserting. I believe I do. And it is telling me that marrying someone I cannot respect, cannot connect with, cannot even tolerate for the sake of preserving a system I no longer believe in entirely would be the greatest act of cowardice I could commit. Elowen studied him for a long moment. What are you asking me, Alaric? The use of his first name, stripped of title, felt like a door opening. I'm asking if you believe connection is possible. If two people from entirely different worlds can build something real, something that does not require one of them to obliterate who they are. I'm asking if you think I am capable of being more than what I have been. I think you are capable of anything you choose to be. The question is whether you are brave enough to choose. And if I choose you? The room fell silent. Elowen rose, walked to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and relentless. When she spoke, her voice was steady but edged with something fragile. If you choose me, you choose war. Your peers will despise you. Your alliances will fracture. Every decision you make will be scrutinized through the lens of whether that low-born woman influenced it. You will be mocked, challenged, possibly ostracized. And I will not make it easy, Alaric. I will not become some docile ornament to smooth the transition. If you want me, you get all of me. Opinions, defiance. Everything you find inconvenient. Good. She turned, surprised. Good? I do not want easy. I have had easy. It nearly killed me. He stood, crossed the room until they were inches apart. I want real. I want someone who will call me out when I'm wrong, who will fight me when I deserve it, who will not let me retreat into the cold machinery I've made of my life. I want you, Elowen Hart, and I am willing to burn down everything I have built to have you." Her eyes searched his face. "You do not know what you are saying. I have never been more certain of anything." They stood in the snow-lit darkness, the distance between them charged with possibility and terror. And then Elowen did something that shattered the last of his control. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. "Then choose," she whispered. "But do it knowing there's no going back." Alaric caught her hand, held it against his cheek. "I am already past the point of return." And there, in the library where he had spent countless nights alone, surrounded by the ghosts of knowledge and the weight of history, Duke Alaric Viremont made a decision that would redefine his world. He leaned down and kissed Elowen Hart, not with the tentative uncertainty of a man testing waters, but with the absolute certainty of someone who had finally found something worth the cost. When they broke apart, she smiled. "Tomorrow, this becomes real. Tomorrow, the consequences begin. Let them come." But tomorrow came faster and harsher than either anticipated. Because in the shadows of Thornwood Park, in the corridors where servants whispered and nobles schemed, forces were already in motion, forces that saw Elowen Hart not as a woman, but as a weapon to be used against the Duke. And the man who held that weapon was someone Alaric had once called friend. Lord Edmund Graves, distant cousin and political rival, had been watching, and he had plans of his own. The morning after the kiss arrived with the kind of brittle clarity that precedes disaster. Alaric woke before dawn, alone in his chambers, the memory of Elowen's touch still burning on his skin like a brand. He had crossed a line he could not uncross, made a choice that would ripple outward in ways he could not yet calculate. For a man who had built his entire existence on control, the lack of certainty should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. The machinery of pretense had finally broken down, and in its place was something raw and unmapped, dangerous, yes, but also undeniably alive. He dressed without summoning his valet, needing the solitude to think. The estate was still dark, servants not yet stirring, and he walked the corridors like a ghost haunting his own life. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every carefully curated detail spoke to a legacy he was now prepared to jeopardize. For what? For a woman who owned nothing, who came from nothing, who represented everything his world would reject. But that rejection was precisely the point. Elowen had forced him to see that the system he had spent decades upholding was not preservation. It was slow suicide dressed as duty. The realization sat heavy in his chest. Power, real power, was not the ability to enforce rules others had written. It was the courage to rewrite them entirely, to say this far and no further, to choose connection over convention even when the cost was catastrophic. Alaric had commanded men in battle, had made decisions that determined who lived and who died, but this choosing of one woman over the approval of an entire social order was the bravest thing he had ever attempted, or the most foolish. History would decide which. He found himself in the library where they had kissed, the room still carrying the faint scent of her, something clean and sharp, like winter air. He touched the chair where she had sat, felt the residual warmth of a life lived without apology, and understood that he was no longer the man who had entered this room yesterday. That man had been a fortress. This man was a question mark, uncertain and exposed, and somehow more real because of it. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Pembroke, the solicitor, entered, looking drawn and anxious. "Your Grace, we have a problem." Alaric turned. "There's always a problem, Pembroke. Specify." The solicitor closed the door carefully. "Lord Edmund Graves has submitted a formal petition to the House of Lords. He is challenging your right to make estate decisions without consulting the family council, citing concerns about your mental fitness and judgment." Alaric's expression did not change, but his hands tightened imperceptibly. "On what grounds? Your association with Miss Hart." He has framed it as evidence of compromised faculties, undue influence by a person of low character. He has gathered testimonies from several nobles who claim to have witnessed erratic behavior. Testimonies from men like Pemberton, no doubt. Alaric walked to the window. "Edmund has been waiting for an opportunity like this. How serious is the petition?" "Very. If the council rules in his favor, they can impose a regency, effectively stripping you of authority over Thornwood Park and the Viremont holdings. He could manage the estate until such time as you are deemed fit, which in practical terms means indefinitely. The trap was elegant. Edmund Graves was Alaric's second cousin, a man who had always resented being born on the wrong side of the family tree. Brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, Edmund had spent years positioning himself as the reasonable alternative to Alaric's iron rule. He championed reform, spoke eloquently about modernization, and behind the smile was a predator who saw vulnerability and moved to exploit it. Elowen was not the problem, she was the pretext. Edmund would have found another excuse eventually.
Alaric had simply handed him a gift-wrapped opportunity.
"What are my options?" Alaric asked. "Publicly distance yourself from Miss Hart. Issue a statement affirming your commitment to traditional values and appropriate conduct. Marry one of the women on the approved list within the next 6 months. Demonstrate stability and conformity. The petition will lose momentum if you remove the ammunition. And if I refuse, then you fight this in court, which will be public, ugly, and uncertain. Edmund has allies. He has crafted a narrative that will be difficult to counter without appearing defensive. The longer this drags on, the more damage it does to your reputation and the estate's stability." Alaric was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Schedule a meeting with the family council for 3 days from now. I will address this directly. Your Grace, I strongly advise, your advice is noted and disregarded. Prepare the meeting." Pembroke gathered his papers, his face a mask of professional disapproval. "As you wish. But understand that what you do in the next 72 hours will determine whether you retain control of everything you have built. Choose wisely." After the solicitor left, Alaric remained at the window, watching dawn break over frozen fields. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his entire life building walls to protect himself from exactly this kind of exposure, and now those walls were being used as evidence against him. The system rewarded conformity and punished deviation. He had always known that. He had simply never cared enough about anything to test the limits. Until now. He needed to speak with Elowen, needed to warn her that the storm was coming, that association with him would paint a target on her back. But more than that, he needed to know if what they had begun in the library was worth the war it would provoke. Because, make no mistake, this was war. Edmund would not stop with a petition. He would use every tool available, every dirty tactic, every whispered rumor to destroy Alaric's credibility and claim what he believed was rightfully his. And in the middle of it all was a woman who had done nothing except refuse to be invisible. But he found Elowen in the conservatory, tending to Lady Marguerite's orchids. His aunt was absent, likely still asleep, and Elowen worked in solitude, her movements careful and precise. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression told him she already knew. "You have heard," he said. "It is all the servants are discussing. Apparently I am a scheming temptress who has ensnared the Duke with dark arts." She set down the watering can. "I believe the head housemaid used the word harlot. Quite Victorian of her." "This is not a joke, Elowen. I am aware." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. "I am also aware that you are about to offer me an escape. Some generous severance, a glowing reference, or perhaps a cottage somewhere far from here where I can live quietly and pretend none of this happened. Am I wrong? No. Then let me save you the speech." She stepped closer. "I do not want your protection if it requires my absence. I do not want safety purchased with silence. And I will not be the convenient excuse for your retreat back into the fortress you have built. We kissed, Alaric. That is all. A kiss does not obligate you to destroy your life. It was not just a kiss, and you know it. Then what was it?" He struggled for words. This man who commanded through certainty and precision. It was a declaration, a refusal to continue pretending that duty and isolation are sustainable. It was me finally admitting that I would rather lose everything than spend the rest of my life in the mausoleum I have made of Thornwood Park. Beautiful words. But words are cheap when the consequences have not yet arrived. Ask me again in 3 days after your council meeting, after Edmund has finished dismantling your reputation. Ask me then if you still believe connection is worth the cost. I already know the answer. Do you? She held his gaze. Because I have lived my entire life as something people use and discard. I have been a tool, a commodity, a problem to be managed. And I will not be that for you, no matter how pretty the cage you offer. If you choose this, choose me. It cannot be a whim or a rebellion. It has to be because you genuinely believe two people can build something real in the ruins of what you are about to burn down. I do believe that. Then prove it. Not with grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. Prove it by standing in front of that council and refusing to apologize for seeing me as a human being worth your time. Prove it by not flinching when they call me every ugly name they can invent. Prove it by being brave enough to want something for yourself instead of sacrificing every desire on the altar of reputation. Her words hit like artillery, precise and devastating. Alaric realized in that moment that Elowen Hart was not someone who needed saving. She was someone who would burn the world down beside him if he gave her reason to, and refused to blink when the flames rose. She was not a damsel, she was a force. 3 days, he said. Give me 3 days to dismantle Edmund's move and secure the estate. Then we will decide what comes next. Together. Together implies equality. Can you actually live with that? Or is this still fantasy? I do not know. His honesty surprised even himself. I have never tried, but I am willing to fail trying rather than succeed at the half-life I have been living. Something shifted in her expression, a wall coming down. All right, 3 days. But Alaric, if you waver, if you choose the comfortable lie over the hard truth, I will leave. Not out of spite, but because I refuse to watch someone I care about destroy themselves slowly when a clean break would be kinder. You care about me. A faint smile touched her lips. Against my better judgment? Yes. You are arrogant, controlling, emotionally repressed, and your idea of compromise is letting someone speak before you overrule them. But beneath all that ice, there is a man who saved a stable boy because he could not bear to be the villain of someone's story. So yes, I care, which is why I will not enable your self-destruction by staying if you choose cowardice over courage. He wanted to kiss her again, to seal the agreement with something tangible, but servants could be watching, and every action now would be ammunition. Instead, he simply nodded. 3 days. 3 days. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in political warfare. Edmund Graves did not wait for the council meeting to launch his assault. He moved with the precision of someone who had been planning this for years, weaponizing every connection, every favor owed, every piece of gossip that could be twisted into scandal. The first salvo came through the newspapers. The London Chronicle, a publication Edmund pardoned through Shell Investments, ran a front-page story speculating about the Duke of Thornwood's unusual relationship with a household companion. The article was careful to avoid outright defamation, instead relying on insinuation and anonymous sources. Friends close to the Duke expressed concern about his recent behavior. Questions arise about the influence of staff members who may not have His Grace's best interests at heart. It was poison wrapped in concern, and it spread through drawing rooms and clubs like plague. Alaric's allies began to waver. Lord Hastings, who had supported the railway expansion, sent a carefully worded letter suggesting perhaps it would be best to postpone the vote until the current difficulties were resolved. Lady Thornbury, a formidable political operator who had once called Alaric the most reliable man in England, declined an invitation to dinner without explanation. One by one, the network of relationships Alaric had cultivated through decades of meticulous effort began to fray. Pembroke delivered hourly updates, each one grimmer than the last. Edmund has secured commitments from 4 of the 7 council members. He is promising them influence over estate decisions, modernization initiatives they have wanted for years. He is painting you as an obstacle to progress, a relic clinging to power out of pride. And the other 3? Alaric asked. Undecided. Waiting to see which way the wind blows. Your Aunt Marguerite is firmly in your corner, but she is only 1 vote. You need at least 4 to maintain majority control. Then I will persuade them. With what? Edmund is offering them everything you have refused: access, influence, reform. What can you offer that he cannot? The truth. Pembroke looked at him as if he had suggested using rose petals as currency. Your Grace, this is politics. The truth is irrelevant. What matters is perception, narrative, power. Edmund has built a compelling story. The old guard refusing to adapt, the tragic figure compromised by inappropriate attachment. You need a counter-narrative equally compelling. I have one. Alaric stood. A man who refuses to let other people's fear dictate his choices. A man who believes loyalty should be earned, not inherited. A man who is willing to burn the entire system down if that system demands he sacrifice his humanity to maintain it. That is not a narrative. That is a suicide note. Then call it what you will. But I am done playing by rules designed to ensure people like Edmund can manipulate their way into power while people like Elowen are dismissed as inconvenient. The solicitor closed his briefcase with a snap. I have served your family for 30 years. I have never seen you like this. I do not know if it is madness or clarity, but I know it terrifies me.
Good. It should, because what comes next will require something more dangerous than strategy. It will require honesty. Us.
The night before the council meeting, Lady Marguerite summoned Alaric to her chambers. His aunt was 83, sharp as a blade despite her years, and the only family member who had ever spoken to him without either fear or ambition coloring the words. She sat in her favorite chair, Elowen reading aloud from a political treatise. When Alaric entered, Marguerite waved her hand. "Give us the room, dear." Elowen rose, squeezed the old woman's shoulder, and left without meeting Alaric's eyes. The door closed softly. "Sit," Marguerite commanded. Alaric obeyed. "You're going to do something monumentally stupid tomorrow, are you not? I'm going to tell the council the truth, which is that I refuse to apologize for caring about someone they deem beneath me, that I will not marry a woman I do not respect, simply to produce heirs for an estate that will survive long after I am dead, that I am choosing to live like a human being instead of a monument." Marguerite studied him for a long moment. "You love her." It was not a question, but Alaric answered anyway. "I do not know. I know I feel more alive in her presence than I have in 20 years. I know that the thought of going back to the cold machinery of my previous existence is unbearable. Whether that is love or simply desperation, I cannot say. It is both." His aunt smiled. "Love is always partly desperation. The desperation to be known, to be seen, to matter to someone in a way that transcends function. You have spent your entire life being useful, Alaric. Useful to your country, useful to your estate, useful to the social order. But useful is not the same as cherished. Elowen sees you, not the Duke, not the war hero, not the administrator. She sees the damaged man beneath, and she chooses to stay anyway. That is either love or its closest cousin. Edmund will destroy me for it, possibly. Or you will destroy him. The outcome is less certain than you think." She leaned forward. "Let me tell you something about Edmund Graves. He is brilliant, charming, and utterly empty. He wants power not because he believes in anything, but because he believes in nothing. People without conviction can be incredibly dangerous because they will say or do anything to achieve their goals. But they are also brittle. When challenged by someone who actually stands for something, they crack. You are telling me to fight. I'm telling you that if you retreat now, you will spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. And that particular hell is worse than any scandal Edmund can manufacture." She reached over and patted his hand. "Your parents would have hated this. They believed in order, hierarchy, the divine right of breeding. I found them insufferable. You are more interesting when you are breaking rules than when you are enforcing them." Alaric felt something tight in his chest loosen. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Thank me when you are still standing after tomorrow. Now go. You need rest. Wars are won by people who show up clear-eyed." He kissed her forehead and left. In the hallway, he found Elowen waiting, leaning against the wall like she had been there the entire time. "She told you to fight, did she not?" Elowen said. "She told me I was more interesting when breaking rules. Wise woman." Elowen pushed off the wall. "For what it is worth, I agree. The version of you that follows orders is competent but dull. The version that questions them is someone I want to know. Even if it destroys me? Especially then. Destruction is just transformation by another name. Sometimes you have to burn down the old growth to make room for something new." They stood in the dim hallway, and Alaric was struck again by the strangeness of this connection. She should have been terrified. Her livelihood, her safety, her entire future hung in the balance. Instead, she was calm, centered, as if she had already accepted the worst and found peace in it. That kind of courage was not taught. It was forged in fires he could only imagine. "What will you do if I lose tomorrow?" he asked. "Survive. I always have." She met his eyes. "But I will miss you. I will miss the possibility of what we might have built. It is not lost yet." "No. But tomorrow will tell us whether it is possible." She turned to leave, paused. Alaric, whatever happens, do not compromise for me. Do not soften your position to spare me embarrassment or protect me from consequences. I chose to be here. I chose to speak. I chose to care about a man who probably should have remained an ice sculpture. Own your choices as fiercely as I own mine, and we will be fine. Waver, and I will never forgive you. Then it was her footsteps fading down the corridor, and Alaric alone with the weight of what tomorrow would demand. The council convened at noon in the estate's formal meeting room, a space that had witnessed 3 centuries of Viramont family decisions. 7 people sat around the oak table: Lady Marguerite, Lord Edmund Graves, Sir Reginald Ashford, Lady Constance Viramont, Mr. Harold Finch, Lord Pemberton, and Dame Elizabeth Thornberry. Each represented a branch of the family or a critical alliance, and each had the power to vote on matters of estate governance. Alaric entered last, dressed in the formal attire expected of such proceedings, his expression unreadable. Edmund was already holding court, his charm deployed like a weapon, making small talk and building rapport. When Alaric took his seat at the head of the table, the room fell silent. Sir Reginald, acting as neutral arbiter, cleared his throat. We convene to address Lord Edmund Graves's petition regarding the Duke's capacity to manage estate affairs without council oversight. Lord Graves, you have the floor. Edmund stood every inch the reasonable reformer. Thank you. Let me begin by saying this brings me no pleasure. The Duke and I have had our differences, but I respect his service and his dedication. However, recent events have raised concerns that cannot be ignored. He paused for effect. The Duke has formed an inappropriate attachment to a household employee, a woman of no standing or qualification, and this attachment has begun to influence his judgment. Marguerite's voice cut through the room like a whip. Define inappropriate. Edmund smiled. My dear aunt, the Duke has been seen spending considerable time alone with Miss Hart, has altered estate policies based on her suggestions, and has alienated key political allies by defending her behavior. This is not a man in full control of his faculties. This is a man compromised. Lord Pemberton nodded. I can attest that the Duke refused to dismiss Miss Hart even when her presence damaged critical negotiations. His behavior was erratic, defensive, and ultimately harmful to estate interests. Alaric remained silent, his gaze steady. Edmund continued, warming to his theme. I propose that the council assume temporary oversight of major estate decisions until such time as the Duke demonstrates renewed stability. This is not punishment, it is protection. Protection of the estate, the tenants, the legacy we all share. And who would manage these decisions? Marguerite asked. You, I presume. A committee, Edmund said smoothly, of which I would be part. Yes. But ultimate authority would rest with the council, not any individual.
How democratic.
Marguerite's sarcasm could have stripped paint. Tell me, Edmund, how long have you been planning this particular coup? This is not a coup. This is responsible governance in response to concerning behavior. Sir Reginald intervened. Duke Viramont, you have remained silent. Do you wish to respond? Alaric stood slowly, every eye in the room fixed on him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and absolutely steady. Lord Graves has accused me of compromised judgment based on my association with Miss Elowen Hart. He is correct that I have spent time with her. He is correct that her perspective has influenced certain decisions. What he fails to acknowledge is that those decisions were improvements, not errors. Miss Hart identified inefficiencies in tenant relations, wage structures, and resource allocation that I, in my devotion to tradition, had overlooked. Listening to her was not weakness. It was intelligence. Edmund opened his mouth, but Alaric continued. Lord Graves speaks of inappropriate attachment. Let me be clear, I am not compromised by Miss Hart. I am challenged by her. Challenged to question assumptions I have held for decades, to examine whether the systems I enforce serve the people they are meant to protect, or simply preserve the comfort of those already in power. If that examination makes you uncomfortable, perhaps the problem is not my judgment, but your complacency. Pemberton sputtered. This is precisely the kind of rhetoric. I am not finished. Alaric's voice dropped to something colder. You accuse me of alienating allies. Which allies? Men like you, Pemberton, who view workers as expendable and profit as the only measure of success. I do not mourn those alliances. I question why I maintained them as long as I did. This is madness, Edmund said, his charm slipping. You are proving my point. You are so infatuated with this woman that you cannot see reason. Alaric turned to face his cousin directly. You are half right. I am infatuated. Infatuated with the possibility that a life spent in service of duty might also include moments of genuine connection. Infatuated with the idea that I could be something other than a mechanism enforcing rules I did not write. But Edmund, understand this. My feelings for Miss Hart do not diminish my capacity to lead. They enhance it. Because for the first time in my life, I am making decisions based on what I believe is right, not what is expected. The room erupted. Pemberton and Edmund shouting about impropriety. Marguerite clapping slowly, the others shifting uncomfortably. Sir Reginald banged his gavel. Order! We will have order! When silence returned, Lady Constance, who had been quiet until now, spoke. Your Grace, are you asking this council to approve of your relationship with a servant? No. Alaric met her gaze. I am telling you that my personal life is not subject to committee review. You may vote on my competence to manage the estate. You may evaluate my decisions on their merits. But you do not get to dictate whom I care about or why. Edmund saw the opening and took it. Then you refuse to distance yourself from Miss Hart? Completely. You refuse to pursue a traditional marriage alliance? Absolutely. Then you leave us no choice. Edmund looked around the table. I call for an immediate vote. All in favor of imposing council oversight on the Duke's authority indicate by show of hands. Pemberton's hand shot up. Edmund's followed. Mr. Finch, a banker who valued stability above all, raised his hesitantly. 3 votes. Marguerite's hand remained down. Dame Elizabeth, who had been silent, studied Alaric for a long moment, then shook her head. 2 against. It came down to Sir Reginald and Lady Constance. The tiebreakers. Sir Reginald sighed. I have known the Duke since he was a boy. I have watched him transform this estate into a model of efficiency. I do not agree with all his choices, but I cannot in good conscience declare him unfit based on what amounts to personal disapproval. He lowered his hand. I vote no. 4-3. The petition would fail unless Lady Constance sided with Edmund. The room held its breath. Lady Constance was 68, a widow who had managed her own holdings with ruthless competence. She looked at Edmund, then at Alaric. Lord Grave speaks of tradition and propriety. She said slowly, The Duke speaks of conviction and change. Both have merit, but I find I am more concerned with the question neither of you has addressed. Not whether the Duke is compromised, but whether this council should have the power to overrule individual judgment at all. We are not a democracy. We are a family trust. And trusts require trust. She turned to Alaric. Your Grace, I do not approve of your choices. I find them reckless and potentially damaging, but they are yours to make. I will not vote to strip you of authority simply because you have chosen an unconventional path. Her hand remained down. The petition failed. 4 votes against, 3 in favor. Edmund's face went white, then red. This is not over. Yes, Alaric said quietly. It is. You made your move. You lost. Accept it with whatever grace you can muster and move on. You have destroyed your reputation for a woman who will abandon you the moment the novelty wears off. You are a fool, perhaps. But I am a fool on my own terms. He looked around the table. This council is dismissed. Those who wish to continue our alliance, you know where to find me. Those who do not, the door is behind you. He walked out without waiting for responses, his heart hammering but his stride steady. Behind him, he heard Marguerite's laughter and Edmund's fury, but he did not turn back. In the hallway, Elowen was waiting. She searched his face. You did not compromise. No. You did not apologize. No. You chose the hard truth over the comfortable lie. Yes. She stepped forward and kissed him, fierce and claiming, right there where anyone could see. When she pulled back, she smiled. Then we have work to do. Because if you think winning 1 vote ends this, you are more naive than I thought. Edmund will regroup. Your allies will test your resolve. And at some point, you will have to decide if I am worth the ongoing cost, not just the dramatic gesture. You are. Prove it daily. Not with grand speeches, with the small choices that accumulate into a life. I will. Good. She took his hand. Now come with me. Your aunt wants to celebrate. and I believe she has broken out the very expensive whiskey she has been hoarding since 1947. They walked together through Thornwood Park. This man who had finally stepped out of the fortress he had built, and this woman who had refused to let him hide there any longer. Behind them, the estate buzzed with gossip and speculation. Ahead, the path was uncertain and fraught with consequence. But for the first time in his life, Alaric Viremont was not walking it alone. And that made all the difference. Mike. The aftermath of the council vote spread through London society like wildfire. By evening, every drawing room from Mayfair to Belgravia was dissecting the scandal. The Duke of Thornwood had openly defied his peers, declared his attachment to a woman of no station, and survived a vote designed to strip him of power. It was unprecedented. It was shocking. It was, depending on whom one asked, either romantic rebellion or aristocratic suicide. Edmund Graves did not take defeat gracefully. Within hours of the vote, he began a whisper campaign far more insidious than his public petition. He spread rumors that Elowen was pregnant, that she had seduced the Duke for financial gain, that Alaric's war injuries had left him mentally unstable and vulnerable to manipulation. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than repetition. Say a lie often enough in the right circles, and it acquired the weight of fact. Alaric's remaining allies began to fracture under the pressure. Lord Hastings withdrew his support for the railway project entirely, citing concerns about the Duke's leadership. Lady Thornbury issued a public statement distancing herself from Thornwood Park, a calculated move to protect her own political interests. Even those who had voted in Alaric's favor at the council meeting now hesitated to be seen associating with him. The cost was steeper than Alaric had anticipated. Not the social ostracism, he had expected that, but the tangible impact on the estate's operations. Contracts were quietly canceled. Invitations to critical negotiations vanished. Suppliers who had worked with Thornwood Park for generations suddenly found themselves too busy to fulfill orders. Edmund was using every connection he had to isolate Alaric economically, betting that financial pressure would accomplish what the council vote could not. Pembroke delivered the grim accounting. We have lost approximately 40% of our usual business relationships. The railway expansion is dead. 3 major tenants are threatening to break their leases and relocate to properties managed by more, quote, stable landlords. If this continues, we will see significant revenue loss within 6 months. Alaric stood at his study window, the winter landscape bleak and unforgiving. Can we sustain operations independently? For a time, but not indefinitely. The estate operates on a network of interdependencies. Cut enough threads, and the whole fabric unravels. He paused. Your Grace, it is not too late to mitigate this. A public statement, a commitment to propriety, even a strategic engagement to one of the approved candidates would go a long way toward no. Then you are choosing principle over survival. I am choosing to survive as someone I can respect. There is a difference. Pembroke closed his ledger. Then I hope Miss Hart is worth bankruptcy. After the solicitor left, Alaric allowed himself a moment of doubt. He had gambled everything on a belief that connection mattered more than convention, but belief did not pay wages or maintain infrastructure. If the estate collapsed, hundreds of people would suffer. Tenants, servants, workers whose livelihoods depended on Thornwood Park's stability. Was his personal fulfillment worth their collective hardship? The door opened without knocking. Elowen entered, took one look at his face, and understood. You are wondering if you made a mistake, she said. I'm wondering if my selfishness will destroy innocent people. She walked to him, took his hands. Listen to me carefully. What Edmund is doing is not your fault. You did not create a system where one man can weaponize social pressure to starve an estate. You did not build an economy where reputation matters more than capability. You inherited that system, and now you are trying to change it, and the system is fighting back. That is not selfishness. That is courage. Courage does not pay bills. No. But neither does cowardice. If you retreat now, you teach everyone watching that power is maintained through conformity, that anyone who steps out of line can be crushed. Is that the lesson you want to leave? He looked at her, this woman who had nothing to lose but chose to stand beside him anyway. You are remarkably calm for someone whose future is evaporating. I told you, I have always survived. But Alaric, you need to understand something. I did not stay because I thought this would be easy. I stayed because I thought it would be real. If you are going to fall, fall fighting for something that matters. Do not fall because you are too afraid to keep standing. Her words steadied him. He pulled her close, felt her heartbeat against his chest, and made a decision. We are not falling, we are adapting. Over the next week, Alaric systematically rebuilt his network from the ground up. Instead of courting the London aristocracy, he reached out to industrialists, reformers, and entrepreneurs, people who valued innovation over tradition. He negotiated directly with workers and tenants, offering them stakes in estate improvements rather than simply extracting rent. He opened Thornwood Park to public tours, generating revenue while demystifying the aristocracy and making the estate a symbol of progressive stewardship rather than feudal excess. It was messy, experimental, and utterly unlike anything a duke had attempted before. And slowly, incrementally, it began to work. Not because society forgave him, but because he stopped asking for forgiveness and started building alternatives. Elowen was instrumental in the transformation. Her understanding of economic theory, her ability to communicate with people across class lines, her refusal to be awed by tradition, all of it made her an invaluable partner in ways no aristocratic wife ever could have been. They worked side by side, often late into the night, arguing over strategies and laughing at failures, and slowly, imperceptibly, falling in love with the hard work of building something new from the ruins of the old. But Edmund was not finished, and his next move would force Alaric to cross the final line from which there could be no return. The trap came in the form of a wedding invitation. Lord Ashford, a powerful ally of Edmund's, was hosting a society event, the marriage of his daughter to a French aristocrat. It was the social event of the season, and every notable family would attend. The invitation to Alaric was deliberate provocation. Attend without Elowen, and he would signal that she was shameful, something to be hidden. Bring Elowen, and he would force a public confrontation in a setting designed to humiliate them both. Elowen read the invitation over breakfast. This is a trap. Obviously. So we decline. Alaric set down his coffee. If we decline, Edmund wins. He demonstrates that we are afraid, that we know our position is indefensible. Every future confrontation will be built on the precedent that we retreated when challenged. If we attend, we hand him a stage to publicly humiliate us, possibly. Or we hand ourselves a stage to redefine what is acceptable. He looked at her. I will not force you into this, but if you are willing, I believe we should attend, together, and make it impossible for anyone to ignore or dismiss you. You want to parade me in front of the people who despise me? I want to stand beside you in front of people who do not matter and show them that their approval is irrelevant. She studied him for a long moment. You understand this will be brutal. They will say things designed to cut. They will test whether you will defend me or fold under pressure. I know, and if you fold, I will not. You cannot promise that. You do not know what they will say. Then I will promise this. I will not let them make you feel small. Whatever they say, whatever they do, you will leave that ballroom knowing you matter more than every sneering face in that room. Elowen smiled, slow and dangerous. All right, let us go to war. The week before the wedding was spent in preparation. Not the usual kind, gowns and jewels and dancing lessons, but strategy. Alaric coached Elowen on the key players, their alliances and weaknesses. Elowen studied political theory and economic policy, so she could engage in substantive conversation rather than vapid small talk. They rehearsed responses to likely provocations, practiced maintaining composure under pressure, and made a pact. No matter what happened, they would leave together on their terms. The night of the wedding arrived cold and clear. Thornwood Park's carriages pulled up to Lord Ashford's London estate, and Alaric stepped out first, then offered his hand to Elowen. She emerged in a gown of deep emerald green, simple but elegant, her hair pinned back to reveal the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She looked every inch a woman who belonged, not because of breeding, but because she refused to believe she did not. Alaric offered his arm. Ready? No, but let us proceed anyway. They walked into the lion's den together, and every eye in the ballroom turned to watch. The ballroom was a cathedral of wealth and judgment, its vaulted ceilings dripping with crystal chandeliers that refracted light into 1,000 glittering accusations. Silk gowns whispered across marble floors, champagne flutes clinked with the hollow music of performance, and every face turned toward Alaric, and Elowen wore the same expression, carefully cultivated shock wrapped in the thin veneer of politeness. This was not merely a social gathering. This was a public execution dressed as celebration, and every person in the room knew it. Lord Ashford greeted them at the entrance, his smile tight enough to crack porcelain. Duke Viermont, he said, his voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to hear. How unexpected. We were not certain you would attend given the, circumstances. I would not miss the marriage of your daughter for anything, Alaric replied evenly. His hand remained on Elowen's arm, a declaration of presence that could not be ignored. May I present Miss Elowen Hart? Ashford's eyes raked over Elowen with the subtlety of a butcher appraising meat. Miss Hart. How? He paused deliberately. Charming. I trust you are enjoying your time at Thornwood Park. Immensely, Elowen said, her voice steady and clear. The Duke has been most gracious in allowing me to contribute to estate improvements. We have implemented several labor reforms that show promising results. How progressive. Ashford's tone suggested he had just smelled something rotten. Do excuse me, I must attend to other guests. He turned away before either could respond, a calculated dismissal designed to set the tone for the evening. They moved deeper into the ballroom, and the crowd parted around them like water around stone. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as they passed, then resumed in urgent whispers that followed in their wake like debris. Alaric felt Elowen's arm tense beneath his hand, the only outward sign of the pressure she was under. Her face remained composed, almost serene, but he knew the cost of that composure. Every step was a gauntlet, every glance a judgment, every whisper a small violence. There is something you need to understand about power in spaces like this. It is not held by those with the loudest voices or the grandest titles. It is held by those who control the narrative, who decide what is acceptable and what is scandal, who enforce invisible rules through collective disapproval. Alaric had spent his entire life operating within those rules, using them to his advantage, leveraging them to maintain authority. Now he was breaking them, and the system was responding the way systems always do when threatened, with coordinated rejection designed to restore order through isolation. They made it halfway across the room before Lady Pemberton blocked their path. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, known for her cutting wit and her ability to socially destroy anyone who crossed her. She looked at Elowen the way one might look at a stain on expensive fabric. Miss Hart, is it? Lady Pemberton said. I do not believe we have been introduced. Then again, I do not typically make the acquaintance of household staff at events of this caliber. Elowen met her gaze without flinching. Then perhaps you should expand your social circle, Lady Pemberton. I have found that limiting oneself to people of similar background often results in remarkably similar thinking, which is to say, limited. The insult landed with surgical precision. Lady Pemberton's face flushed crimson. I beg your pardon? You are pardoned. Elowen smiled, glacial and perfect. Now, if you will excuse us, the Duke and I were just discussing recent developments in agricultural land management. Terribly dull for most, but fascinating if one actually cares about productivity over appearances. They moved past before Lady Pemberton could recover. Alaric heard the woman's outraged sputtering behind them and felt a fierce surge of admiration. Elowen was not merely surviving this assault. She was engaging on her own terms, refusing to be diminished by people whose only weapon was inherited superiority. But the evening was young, and the wolves were circling. Edmund Graves appeared as if summoned by malice itself. He was dressed impeccably, his smile warm and his eyes glacial. Cousin, he said, clasping Alaric's hand with false bonhomie, how brave of you to attend. And Miss Hart, looking lovely as always, tell me, do you find these gatherings as tedious as I do? All this pretense and posturing when we could be discussing matters of actual substance. It was a trap disguised as alliance, an attempt to separate Elowen from Alaric by feigning interest in her opinions. Elowen recognized it immediately. I find them educational, she said. One learns a great deal about character by observing how people behave when they believe civility provides cover for cruelty. Edmund's smile never wavered. How perceptive. You must share your observations with me sometime. I am always interested in alternative perspectives. Alternative to what? Elowen asked. To yours or to reality? The barb struck home. Edmund's eyes hardened, but his tone remained light. Reality is such a subjective concept. Do you not agree? For instance, some might say the reality is that a duke should marry within his station. Others might argue that individual happiness matters more than social convention. Who is to say which reality is correct? The person living it, Elowen said, not the chorus of voices insisting they know better. Edmund turned to Alaric. You have found yourself quite the philosopher, cousin. I do hope her wisdom extends to practical matters. Running an estate requires more than idealism. It requires understanding that an estate is made of people, not property, Alaric said quietly. Something you have never grasped. I grasp perfectly well. I simply recognize that people, like property, require management. Speaking of which, Edmund gestured across the room. I believe Lord Hastings wishes to speak with you. Something about the railway contracts you lost. Perhaps he has found a more reliable partner. The jab was designed to remind Alaric of the cost of his choices. Hastings stood near the far wall, deep in conversation with a group of investors, none of whom looked in Alaric's direction. The message was clear. The world was moving on without him, building alliances and opportunities from which he was now excluded. Alaric felt Elowen's hand tighten on his arm. Ignore him, she murmured. He is trying to provoke you into reacting. But Edmund was not finished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping so only they could hear. I must confess, cousin, I almost admire your commitment to this farce. Most men would have realized by now that passion is a poor substitute for stability. But you have always been stubborn. I suppose that is why you survived the war. Pity it is the quality that will destroy you now. Before Alaric could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted, and through the gap walked a woman Alaric had not seen in nearly 20 years. Catherine, not dead, not buried in the family crypt as he had believed for 2 decades. Very much alive, dressed in widow's black that suddenly felt obscene, her face older but unmistakable. His wife, his supposedly deceased wife, standing in Lord Ashford's ballroom like a ghost made flesh. The room went silent. Every eye turned from Catherine to Alaric to Elowen and back again. The scandal unfolding in real time like a play written by a sadistic playwright. Alaric felt the ground shift beneath him. This was not possible. He had seen her death certificate, attended her funeral, mourned in whatever hollow way he was capable of mourning. She had been dead for 19 years. Dead and buried and gone. Yet here she stood, very much alive, and the implications crashed over him like artillery fire. If Catherine was alive, he was still married. If he was still married, everything with Elowen was adultery. If it was adultery, Edmund had not just won, he had eviscerated Alaric's position so thoroughly that there would be no recovery. Catherine walked toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted, creating a corridor of witnesses. When she reached him, she stopped, her eyes meeting his with an expression he could not read. Hello, Alaric, she said softly. I imagine you are surprised to see me. Surprise does not begin to describe it. His voice came out strangled, unfamiliar even to himself. You are dead. I buried you. You buried someone, Catherine agreed. But not me. She looked at Elowen, then back at Alaric. Perhaps we should speak privately. This is not a conversation for public consumption. Everything about this is public consumption, Edmund interjected, stepping forward. Lady Catherine, may I say what a relief it is to see you restored to us? Your survival is nothing short of miraculous. Miraculous is one word for it, Catherine said. Her tone was neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or calculation. Lord Graves, I would prefer to speak with my husband alone. Of course. Edmund bowed slightly. But do understand that certain legal realities must be addressed. A marriage that was never dissolved remains binding. I am certain the Duke's solicitor will confirm this. Alaric barely heard him. His mind was racing through implications, trying to understand how this was possible, what it meant, who had orchestrated it. Because this was orchestrated, Catherine's appearance at this specific event, in front of these specific people, at the exact moment Alaric was most vulnerable was no accident. This was Edmund's masterstroke, the final move in a game Alaric had not even realized was being played. Elowen had gone very still beside him. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Your Grace, perhaps you should speak with your wife. I will wait outside. No, the word came out harder than he intended. You will not be dismissed like an inconvenience. If Catherine has something to say, she can say it here. Catherine's expression softened. Alaric, please, I have no wish to humiliate you or Miss Hart, but there are things you need to understand, and this room full of vultures is not the place. She was right, and he hated her for it. He looked at Elowen, trying to convey reassurance he did not feel. I will return shortly. Elowen nodded, her face unreadable. I will be here. He followed Catherine through a side door into a private sitting room. The moment the door closed, she turned to face him, and the composure cracked. Alaric,
I am so sorry.
I never wanted it to happen this way. Explain, now.
She sat, suddenly looking exhausted.
I did not die of pneumonia. I left. I fled because I could not bear the emptiness of our marriage, the suffocating weight of being Lady Viermont when I was dying inside. I went to France, changed my name, started over. I thought you would move on, remarry, be happier without me.
So, you let me believe you were dead.
I paid someone to forge documents, yes. It was wrong. I know that now. But at the time it seemed like the only escape. She looked up at him. I have lived in Paris for 19 years, Alaric. Built a life, found some measure of peace. I never intended to return. Yet here you are. Her jaw tightened. Edmund found me. I do not know how, but he did. He showed up at my home 3 weeks ago with photographs, records, proof of my identity. He said if I did not return and reveal myself publicly, he would expose me as a fraud and have me arrested for falsifying death records. He said he would ruin the life I had built unless I cooperated in destroying me. I did not want to. Catherine stood, pacing. But he was convincing. He said you had become unstable, that you were jeopardizing the estate, that this was necessary to protect the family legacy.
He promised that if I came forward, made the marriage technically valid again, he would help us both quietly dissolve it, and I could return to France with enough money to live comfortably.
It seemed like a way to undo the damage I caused without destroying either of us further. And you believed him.
I wanted to believe him.
She met his eyes. I am not a strong person, Alaric. I never was. I ran from our marriage because I lacked the courage to end it honestly.
And I came back because I lacked the courage to refuse Edmund. I know what that makes me. I know I have given him exactly what he needed to destroy you. But I did not know about Miss Hart. I did not know you had finally found something real. If I had, she trailed off. I do not know if it would have changed my decision, but I would have felt worse about it. Alaric stood at the window looking out at the London night. The fury he expected did not come. Instead, there was only a cold, clear understanding of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. Edmund had not just found a legal loophole, he had weaponized Alaric's past against him, turning a marriage Alaric thought buried into a chain that would drag him back into the suffocating conformity he had tried to escape. What do you want, Catherine? To dissolve the marriage properly, to give you the freedom you should have had 19 years ago. But Edmund controls the narrative now. If we move forward with divorce proceedings, he will use it to paint you as morally compromised, abandoning your lawful wife for a servant. If we do nothing, you remain married, and your relationship with Miss Hart becomes adultery. Either way, he wins. Unless we find a third option. There is no third option. Catherine's voice was gentle. Alaric, you have lost. Edmund has made certain of that. The question now is how much more you are willing to sacrifice trying to fight a battle that is already decided. The question is whether I am willing to let men like Edmund decide what my life looks like. His voice was flat, emotionless. I have spent decades following rules I did not write, conforming to expectations I did not choose, being the duke everyone demanded instead of the man I might have been. I will not go back to that, not for Edmund, not for society, not even to save the estate. Then what will you do? I will do what I should have done 20 years ago. I will choose truth over convenience and accept the consequences. He walked out before she could respond. When he returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted from malicious curiosity to open predation. The news had spread. Catherine Viermont was alive. The Duke's marriage was valid. Elowen Hart was not a scandalous romance, but an adulteress. The room buzzed with it, the story growing more lurid with each retelling. Elowen stood exactly where he had left her, surrounded by a loose circle of women who were clearly delivering verbal lacerations disguised as concern. She looked up as he approached, and the relief in her eyes was quickly suppressed. "Ladies," Alaric said coldly, "if you will excuse us." They scattered. Elowen searched his face. "How bad is it?" "Worse than I imagined." He took her hand, not caring who saw. "Catherine is alive. Our marriage was never dissolved. Edmund orchestrated her return to destroy any legal or moral standing I have. If we continue this relationship, it is adultery. If I divorce Catherine, Edmund will use it to paint me as abandoning my lawful wife for base desire. If I do nothing, you and I must end. So we have lost." "No." He pulled her closer. "We have lost if we accept their framework, if we play by rules designed to ensure our failure. but I'm done playing by their rules. What are you saying? I am saying that I will not apologize for choosing you. I will divorce Catherine, absorb whatever scandal that creates, and accept that society will condemn me. I will lose alliances, lose respect, possibly lose the estate if Edmund pushes hard enough. But I will not lose you. Unless that is not what you want, Elowen stared at him. You would give up everything. I would give up everything I thought mattered to keep the one thing that actually does. Before she could respond, Edmund's voice cut through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have your attention. The crowd fell silent. Edmund stood on the raised platform where the orchestra had been, commanding the room with ease. He looked like a man about to deliver a eulogy for an enemy, solemn and satisfied. It is with great sadness that I must address a situation that has come to light this evening. My cousin, the Duke of Thornwood, has been engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a member of his household staff while legally married to Lady Catherine Viermont. This is not conjecture or rumor. Lady Catherine herself has returned to confirm the validity of their marriage. He paused, letting the words sink in. I take no pleasure in exposing this, but the integrity of our institutions demands accountability. A man who cannot honor the most basic commitment, marriage, cannot be trusted with the stewardship of an estate or the responsibility of governance. Alaric felt Elowen start to pull away, to spare him further damage by removing herself. He held her hand tighter. Edmund continued, Therefore, I'm calling for a formal inquiry into the Duke's fitness to manage the Viermont estate and titles. Furthermore, I move that the family council assume immediate control of all estate operations pending resolution of these matters. This is not personal. This is preservation of legacy and protection of those who depend on stable leadership. The room erupted in murmurs. Some looked scandalized. Others looked gleeful. A few looked uncomfortable but unwilling to oppose the social tide. And then something unexpected happened. Lady Marguerite stepped forward, her cane tapping sharply on the marble floor. The crowd parted for her, this ancient woman who had seen monarchs rise and fall, who had survived scandals and wars and revolutions in thought, and who feared absolutely nothing. Edmund Graves, she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. You sanctimonious little worm. The room gasped. Marguerite ignored them. You stand there speaking of integrity while orchestrating a cruel manipulation of a woman you blackmailed into cooperation. You speak of legacy while attempting to seize power through manufactured scandal. You speak of accountability while hiding behind procedure and propriety to mask your ambition. She turned to address the room. My nephew is many things, stubborn, inflexible, emotionally constipated on his best days. But he is not dishonorable. He believed his wife dead for 19 years. That is not adultery. That is surviving with the information he had. Edmund opened his mouth, but Marguerite was not finished. And as for Miss Hart, I have spent 6 months in her company. She is more intelligent, more principled, and more genuinely concerned with human welfare than most people in this room combined. If my nephew has chosen her over the parade of vapid aristocrats, you would have him marry. That is evidence of good judgment, not poor character.
Lady Marguerite, Edmund said smoothly, your loyalty to your nephew is admirable, but does not change the facts. The marriage exists. The relationship is therefore improper. The law is clear.
The law is also clear that blackmail and coercion invalidate consent, Marguerite shot back. Lady Catherine was forced to return under threat. Any testimony she gives is therefore suspect. And before you try to silence me with procedure, understand that I am 83 years old, wealthier than most countries, and utterly unafraid of your disapproval. I will burn every bridge in this room if it means my nephew retains the freedom to live as something other than a monument to your ambition. The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund's composure cracked, just for a moment, revealing the fury beneath. Then he smiled. How touching. But passion is not strategy, Lady Marguerite. The council will convene regardless of your objections. The inquiry will proceed. And when the dust settles, Thornwood Park will be managed by someone capable of putting duty before desire. Then let the inquiry begin, Alaric said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. Let every sordid detail be examined in public. Let the world see exactly how you manipulated a vulnerable woman, forged alliances through threats, and weaponized procedure to seize power. Because Edmund, here is what you have failed to understand. I do not care anymore. I do not care about reputation or social standing, or whether the London elite approve of my choices. I care about building a life that does not require me to sacrifice my humanity to maintain it. And if that means I lose the estate, lose the title, lose everything except my integrity, then I will count it a victory." The crowd was riveted. This was not the cold, controlled Duke they knew. This was something raw and dangerous. Alaric continued, "You want Thornwood Park? Take it. Manage it with your committee and your modernization plans and your absolute certainty that you know better than everyone else. But understand that you will be managing an empty shell. Because the thing that made Thornwood Park matter was never the land or the title. It was the commitment to the people who live and work there. And that commitment does not transfer with a council vote." He turned to Elowen. "We are leaving." She looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You are walking away from everything. I am walking away from nothing. I am walking toward the only thing that matters." They moved toward the exit. The crowd parted, silent and stunned. Behind them, Edmund was already calling for order, already spinning the narrative, already positioning himself as the reasonable authority restoring stability. But Alaric did not look back. They emerged into the London night, cold air hitting like a slap. The carriage waited, and Alaric helped Elowen inside. As they pulled away from Lord Ashford's estate, she finally spoke. "What happens now?" "Now we rebuild." "Not the estate. Let Edmund have that if he wants it so badly. We rebuild a life on terms we choose." He looked at her. "I meant what I said. I will divorce Catherine, absorb the scandal, and move forward. If you will have me, you will lose everything. I have already lost everything that did not matter. What I am gaining is infinitely more valuable. And if I say no, if I say the cost is too high, then I will respect that. But I hope you do not." Elowen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I spent my entire life being told my worth was measured by my usefulness to people more important than me. That my opinions mattered less because I owned nothing, that my intelligence was irrelevant because I lacked pedigree. I have been invisible, dismissible, expendable. And then I met a man so trapped in his own cage that he did not realize he held the key. We broke each other out, Alaric. Not gently, not easily, but thoroughly. So no, the cost is not too high, because what we are buying is the right to be human together, and that is worth any price." He pulled her close, and they sat in silence as the carriage rolled through London streets, carrying them away from the wreckage of one life and toward the uncertain promise of another. But the wreckage was not finished with them yet. They arrived at Thornwood Park near midnight to find the estate in chaos. Servants stood in clusters, whispering urgently. Lights blazed in windows that should have been dark. And in the courtyard stood Pembroke, the solicitor, flanked by two men Alaric did not recognize. "Your Grace," Pembroke said as Alaric stepped from the carriage, "I'm afraid I must inform you that the family council has voted in emergency session. By a vote of 5-2, they have assumed control of estate operations and suspended your authority pending formal inquiry. These gentlemen are here to ensure the transition is orderly." "On whose authority did the council convene without my presence?" Alaric demanded. Lord Graves invoked the crisis clause in the estate charter. Given the public revelations tonight, the council deemed immediate action necessary to prevent further damage. One of the men stepped forward. "Your Grace, we have been instructed to secure all estate documents, financial records, and operational materials. We are also to inform you that you are prohibited from making any further decisions regarding estate personnel or resources until the inquiry concludes." Alaric looked at Pembroke. "You're complicit in this." The solicitor had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I serve the estate, Your Grace, not any individual. The council's vote was legal. I have no choice but to enforce it. There is always a choice. You simply made yours." Alaric turned to the servants gathered in the courtyard. Many of them looked terrified, uncertain of what this power shift meant for their livelihoods. He recognized Thomas, the stable boy he had saved, and Mrs. Fletcher, the head of housekeeping, and dozens of others whose lives were now caught in the crossfire of a war they did not start. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "What happens to me in the coming weeks is uncertain, but I want you to know that every decision I made regarding this estate was made with your welfare in mind. If the new management treats you poorly, if they cut wages or impose harsher conditions, remember that you have value beyond their willingness to recognize it. Do not let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by your usefulness to people who see you as expendable." "That is quite enough," one of the enforcers said. "You are no longer in a position to address the staff." "I am not addressing the staff.
I am addressing human beings. There is a difference. Elowen stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor. Where will you go? She asked quietly. I do not know. But anywhere is better than remaining in a place I no longer control.
They gathered a few personal belongings under the watchful eyes of the enforcers. Alaric took nothing of value. No family heirlooms, no documents, no symbols of the life he was leaving behind. Only clothes, books, and one photograph of his parents that he had kept out of obligation rather than affection. When they emerged, Lady Marguerite was waiting. You stubborn fool, she said, but there was affection in it. You could have compromised, bought yourself time, played the long game. I have been playing the long game my entire life. It nearly killed me. He kissed her forehead. Thank you for standing with me tonight. It meant more than you know. Where will you go? London, I think. Find lodging, hire a solicitor who is not Edmund's creature, and begin divorce proceedings. Beyond that, I have no plan. Good. Plans are overrated. She pressed an envelope into his hand. Money. Enough to keep you comfortable while you sort things out. And before you refuse out of pride, understand that I am doing this for me as much as you. I have no intention of watching Edmund preen over his victory without knowing you have the resources to fight back. Alaric accepted the envelope. Thank you. Marguerite turned to Elowen. Take care of him. He is brilliant at strategy and terrible at being human. You are the reverse. Between you, there might be one functional person. I will do my best, Elowen said. They left Thornwood Park as the first light of dawn broke over the frozen fields. Alaric did not look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing, only the shell of a life he had finally been brave enough to abandon. The coach carried them toward London, toward uncertainty, toward a future that promised nothing except the freedom to define it themselves. And for the first time in his life, Alaric Viermont felt the weight of expectation lift, replaced by something terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Possibility. But Edmund Graves was not a man who left loose ends. And as Alaric would soon discover, the war was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun, because buried in the estate documents Edmund now controlled was information about Alaric's military service, operations that had never been officially acknowledged, decisions that could not withstand public scrutiny, secrets that certain people in the government had very good reasons to keep buried. And Edmund, in his thorough dismantling of Alaric's life, had just uncovered all of them. The final blow would not come from society or family or reputation. It would come from the state itself, in the form of charges that could not be fought with wealth or title or conviction. Charges that carried the weight of treason, the threat of imprisonment, and the absolute certainty that this time there would be no escape. The London flat was barely large enough to qualify as lodging. 2 cramped rooms above a tobacconist's shop in Clerkenwell, the kind of place where paint peeled in long strips from water-stained walls and the smell of damp never quite disappeared. Alaric sat at a scarred wooden table, staring at documents spread before him like evidence at a trial, and tried to understand how quickly a life could be dismantled by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Edmund had been thorough. Devastatingly, methodically thorough. Within 48 hours of seizing control of Thornwood Park, he had filed formal complaints with 3 separate government agencies, each one carefully crafted to appear legitimate while hiding the malice beneath. The documents alleged financial irregularities in estate management, improper use of ducal authority for personal gain, and most damaging of all, potential violations of the Official Secrets Act related to Alaric's military service. That last accusation was the killing blow. During his years as a colonel, Alaric had commanded operations that existed in the gray space between warfare and diplomacy, the kind of missions governments authorize in private and deny in public. He had negotiated with warlords, bribed officials in hostile territories, and on 2 occasions personally executed prisoners who posed intelligence risks too severe to be managed through conventional channels. All of it sanctioned, all of it necessary, none of it documented in ways that would survive public scrutiny. Edmund had somehow obtained partial records of those operations, likely through contacts in the intelligence services who owed him favors or feared his political reach. The records were incomplete, stripped of context, and presented in ways that made legitimate military action look like criminal conspiracy. And because the operations had been classified, Alaric could not defend himself without violating secrecy oaths that carried prison sentences of their own. It was a perfect trap. Defend himself and face prosecution for revealing state secrets, remain silent, and face prosecution for the crimes Edmund alleged. Either way, Edmund won. Elowen entered carrying bread and cheese purchased from the market, the kind of simple meal that would have been beneath notice at Thornwood Park, but now represented their entire food budget for 2 days. She set it down, studied Alaric's face, and understood immediately.
How bad? She asked.
Terminal. He pushed the documents toward her. Edmund has filed charges under the Official Secrets Act. There will be an inquiry, likely followed by prosecution. If convicted, I am looking at 20 years in prison, possibly more depending on how aggressively they pursue it. She read in silence, her expression darkening with each page. This is insane. You were following orders. You were serving your country. Orders that were never officially given by people who will never officially acknowledge them. He stood, paced the narrow room like a caged animal. I cannot prove authorization without violating the very laws they are using to prosecute me. And even if I could, the government has every incentive to throw me to the wolves. Better one disgraced duke than a scandal that reaches into the highest levels of military command. So they will sacrifice you to protect themselves. Welcome to how power actually works. He stopped at the window, looked out at gray London streets. I have spent my entire life believing that service and duty would be rewarded with loyalty. That if I followed the rules, honored my commitments, did the hard things no one else would do, the system would protect me in return. And now I understand that the system only protects itself. Individuals are expendable the moment we become inconvenient. There was something liberating in the realization, a final severing of the chains he had worn for so long. He had built his identity around being indispensable, the man who could be relied upon to do what needed doing regardless of cost. But indispensable was a lie. Everyone was replaceable. The only question was whether you would be discarded quietly or destroyed publicly, and Edmund had chosen the latter with surgical precision. Elowen set the documents aside and walked to him. So what do? We fight. Not because I believe we can win, but because the alternative is accepting that men like Edmund get to rewrite reality to serve their ambition. He will not take everything from me without a fight, even if the fight destroys you, especially then, because destruction on my terms is still choice. Submission is erasure. She kissed him, hard and fierce, a declaration that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with shared defiance. When she pulled back, her eyes were burning. Then let us make them work for it. Let us make Edmund and everyone who enabled him pay for every inch of ground they take. And if we are going down, we take them with us. The question was how. Alaric had no resources, no allies willing to publicly support him, and no legal avenue that did not lead directly to prison. What he had was intimate knowledge of how the system worked, the instincts of someone who had spent decades navigating power structures, and the absolute freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. And he had one other thing: information. During his years managing Thornwood Park, he had accumulated extensive files on the very people now moving against him. Lord Pemberton's financial dealings that skirted tax law. Lord Ashford's relationship with a mistress he kept in a Kensington townhouse while his wife remained publicly ignorant. Sir Reginald's son, whose gambling debts had been quietly paid by bribes disguised as consulting fees. Edmund himself, whose reform credentials hid investments in factories with labor conditions that would spark riots if made public. None of it was enough to counter the charges against Alaric, but all of it was enough to make the people orchestrating his destruction very uncomfortable. And discomfort, applied correctly, could become leverage. He spent the next 3 days building a dossier, cross-referencing records he had kept, receipts he had saved, and correspondence he had never thought to weaponize. Elowen helped, her mind sharp and her memory for detail uncanny. Together they constructed a map of corruption, hypocrisy, and carefully hidden scandals that touched nearly every member of the coalition Edmund had assembled. The solicitor Alaric hired, a sharp-eyed woman named Marguerite Hale, who specialized in defending impossible cases, reviewed the material with professional skepticism. "This is blackmail," she said flatly. "If you release this, you will be prosecuted for extortion in addition to the existing charges." "Only if I release it publicly," Alaric replied. "What if I simply ensure that certain parties know I possess this information and am willing to use it if pushed too far?" "Not a threat, simply a statement of fact." "That is still blackmail, just with extra steps." Hale leaned back in her chair. "But it might work. Not to get the charges dropped. Those are too politically valuable to Edmund, but to prevent them from escalating further. Keep the inquiry contained, limit the damage, buy you time to mount a proper defense. And how do I mount a proper defense when the evidence I need is classified? You do not defend against the charges. You attack the process. Demonstrate that the inquiry itself is politically motivated, that Edmund orchestrated it to seize power rather than pursue justice. Get enough people questioning his motives, and the whole structure starts to crack. It was a long shot, but it was something. Alaric authorized Hale to begin making discreet contact with key figures, letting them know that cooperation would be rewarded with silence, while opposition would be met with exposure. The responses came back within 24 hours, and they painted a picture of an establishment terrified of its own contradictions. Pemberton agreed to abstain from further participation in the inquiry. Ashford quietly withdrew his public statements condemning Alaric. Sir Reginald sent a terse note suggesting that perhaps the charges were being pursued with undue haste and should be reconsidered. One by one, the coalition fractured as individuals prioritized self-preservation over collective action. But Edmund did not fracture. If anything, the defections made him more dangerous. He had gambled everything on destroying Alaric, and retreat now would mean his own political annihilation. So he doubled down, pushing the inquiry forward with increased aggression, calling in favors from figures even Alaric could not touch, and making it clear that this had become personal. The inquiry convened in a government building in Westminster, a gray stone structure that smelled of old paper and institutional power. Alaric sat across from a panel of 3 officials. Lord Justice Hartwell, a career bureaucrat known for rigid adherence to procedure. Colonel Staines, a military officer whose expression suggested he had already decided guilt. And Dame Victoria Cross, a political appointee whose presence was purely ornamental. The room was small, airless, designed to intimidate. Edmund sat in the gallery, watching with the satisfaction of a hunter who had driven prey into an inescapable corner. The proceedings began with Justice Hartwell reading the charges in a monotone that drained them of human context, reducing years of service and sacrifice to a list of alleged violations. Duke Viremont, you are accused of conducting unauthorized military operations, executing prisoners without due process, falsifying operational reports, and conspiring to conceal these actions from proper oversight. How do you respond? Alaric stood. Not guilty. On all counts. Colonel Staines leaned forward. We have documentation suggesting otherwise. Records indicating you personally ordered the execution of at least 2 individuals during operations in the Balkans in 2004. Do you deny this? I deny nothing. I also confirm nothing. Those operations were classified, conducted under authority I am not at liberty to discuss. If you want details, subpoena the officers who gave the orders.
I am certain they will be delighted to testify.
It was a calculated gamble. The officers in question were high-ranking officials who would never publicly acknowledge the operations, and forcing them to testify would expose the government to exactly the kind of scandal it wanted to avoid. Staines understood this immediately, and his jaw tightened. You hide behind classification to avoid accountability, Staines said. I hide behind nothing. I am bound by the same secrecy oaths you are, Colonel. If this inquiry wishes me to violate those oaths, put it in writing and I will comply. But understand that doing so will open doors you cannot close. Justice Hartwell intervened. This inquiry is not interested in political theater, Your Grace. We are here to determine whether you acted within the bounds of your authority. If you cannot provide evidence of that authority without violating secrecy laws, then we must proceed based on available information. Available information provided by a man with every incentive to see me destroyed, Alaric shot back. Lord Graves has not presented evidence. He has presented fragments, stripped of context, arranged to tell a story that serves his ambition. And you are allowing it because prosecuting me is politically expedient. That is a serious accusation, Dame Victoria said. It is a serious situation. Alaric turned to address the room. I have served this country for over 20 years. I have done things I am not proud of because someone in this government decided they needed doing. I have carried secrets that would end careers, destroy reputations, and topple administrations. And now, because I made the mistake of crossing someone with the right connections, those secrets are being weaponized against me. If you proceed with this prosecution, you set a precedent. Anyone who serves loyally can be discarded the moment they become inconvenient. Is that the message you want to send? The room fell silent. Justice Hartwell exchanged glances with the other panel members. Finally, he said, We will adjourn for deliberation. You will be notified of our decision within 48 hours. Alaric left the building knowing he had bought time, nothing more. The inquiry would likely recommend prosecution. The government would move forward to avoid looking weak, and he would end up in a courtroom defending actions he could not fully explain against accusations he could not fully refute. Outside, Elowen was waiting. She searched his face and saw the exhaustion there. "They will come after you," she said. "Yes. And there is nothing we can do to stop it."
Nothing conventional. But I am done with conventional. He took her hand. "I need you to do something for me. Something that will put you at risk. Tell me. I need you to go to the newspapers. Not the ones Edmund controls, but the independent ones. The ones that still believe in actual journalism. I need you to tell them everything.
The blackmail that brought Catherine back. The manipulation of the council vote. The way Edmund is using state power to settle a personal vendetta. Make it public. Make it loud. And make it impossible to ignore. They will destroy me for it," Elowen said. "A woman with no credibility accusing powerful men of conspiracy. I will be dismissed as a scorned mistress spreading lies." "Probably, but you will also plant seeds of doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows. People will start asking questions Edmund cannot answer. The inquiry will no longer be a quiet administrative process. It will be a public spectacle. And spectacles are harder to control. You are asking me to sacrifice my reputation to save yours. I am asking you to fight beside me the only way we have left." He met her eyes. "I will not blame you if you refuse. This is not your war." She laughed, sharp and bitter. "Not my war? Alaric, I have been fighting this war my entire life, fighting to be seen as more than property, more than decoration, more than a convenience. You are the first person who ever treated me as an equal, and you are being destroyed for it. So yes, I will go to the newspapers. I will tell them everything. And when they dismiss me as a liar and a whore, I will keep talking until someone listens." They went to 3 newspapers before finding one willing to run the story. The editor was a grizzled man named Thomas Brennan, who had built his career on exposing corruption and had no love for the aristocracy. He listened to Elowen's account, asked pointed questions, and then sat back with a grim smile. "This will be the biggest story of the year," he said. "It will also make me a lot of enemies. I need corroboration, documents, witnesses, something beyond your word." Alaric provided copies of the documents Hale had compiled. Records of Edmund's meetings with Catherine in Paris. Financial transfers that suggested payment for cooperation. Correspondence between Edmund and council members coordinating the vote against Alaric. It was not proof in a legal sense, but it was evidence enough to support the narrative. Brennan agreed to run the story in 2 days, giving Alaric time to prepare for the fallout. The article, when it published, was devastating. It laid out Edmund's orchestration of the scandal in meticulous detail, questioned the legitimacy of the inquiry, and painted a picture of institutional corruption that went far beyond one family's internal conflict. The response was immediate and explosive. Edmund issued furious denials. The government claimed the article was baseless speculation designed to undermine legitimate oversight. Several members of the panel called for Brennan to be charged with libel, but the public was fascinated. The story had everything: a duke fallen from grace, a powerful villain, a woman fighting against impossible odds, and the hint that those in authority were hiding something. Within 48 hours, other newspapers picked it up, adding their own investigations, uncovering additional details, turning Edmund's carefully controlled narrative into a sprawling scandal he could no longer manage. The inquiry reconvened in chaos. Protesters gathered outside the government building, some supporting Alaric, others demanding his prosecution, all of them turning the process into a circus. Inside, Justice Hartwell looked haggard. Due to recent publicity, this inquiry has become untenable as a confidential proceeding. We are suspending deliberations pending a formal review of the charges and the process by which they were brought. It was not victory, it was not even vindication, but it was survival. The inquiry would not move forward immediately, which meant Alaric would not be arrested, which meant he had time to continue fighting. Edmund's rage was palpable. He stood in the gallery and pointed at Alaric like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You have corrupted this process," he said, his voice shaking. "You have weaponized the press, manipulated public opinion, and turned what should have been a straightforward accountability measure into a media spectacle. This is exactly why you are unfit for authority." "No, Edmund,"
Alaric replied quietly. This is exactly why you are. You believe power is the ability to control outcomes, to manipulate systems, to ensure that your version of reality becomes the official record. But power without legitimacy is just force, and force, when exposed, becomes tyranny. I did not corrupt this process. I revealed that it was corrupt from the beginning. Edmund stepped forward, his composure finally shattering. You self-righteous bastard. You stand there pretending this is about principle when it is about ego. You could not bear to lose, so you burned everything down rather than accept defeat gracefully. You are right, Alaric said. I could not bear to lose. Not because of ego, but because losing meant accepting that my life, my service, my sacrifices meant nothing. That I could be erased by someone who wanted what I had and was willing to destroy me to get it. So yes, I fought back. And I will continue fighting back until one of us is finished. Then let us finish it. Edmund's voice dropped to something colder. You want a war? You have one. I will use every resource, every connection, every tool at my disposal to destroy you. And when I am done, there will be nothing left. Not your reputation, not your freedom, not even the memory of who you were before you decided that a servant was worth sacrificing everything for. She has a name, Alaric said, and she is worth more than everything you have ever built. Edmund turned and walked out, his exit punctuated by the slam of the heavy door. The room sat in shocked silence. Justice Hartwell cleared his throat. This inquiry is adjourned indefinitely. We will reconvene when appropriate procedures can be established. Alaric left the building knowing the war was no longer contained. Edmund would escalate, would use methods even more ruthless than before, and would not stop until one of them was completely destroyed. That night, back in the cramped flat, Alaric and Elowen sat in silence. The adrenaline of confrontation had faded, leaving only exhaustion and the creeping awareness of how precarious their position remained. He will come for us, Elowen said. Not through courts or inquiries. He will come directly. I know. Alaric stared at the ceiling. Edmund has lost patience with procedure. When men like him reach that point, they become unpredictable and dangerous. What can he do that he has not already done? The question hung between them, unanswered but understood. Edmund could manufacture criminal charges, could have Alaric arrested on fabricated evidence, could use connections in less savory circles to ensure problems disappeared permanently. The line between legal warfare and actual violence was thinner than most people wanted to believe, and Edmund had already demonstrated his willingness to cross ethical boundaries. Alaric rose, paced the small room. There was something he had been considering, something drastic and possibly suicidal, but it was the only move left that Edmund would not anticipate. I'm going back to Thornwood Park, he said. Elowen stared at him. That is insane. Edmund controls the estate. He has enforcers there, legal authority, everything. You will be arrested the moment you set foot on the grounds. Probably, but Edmund's control of Thornwood Park is based on legal technicality and the council's vote. If I can demonstrate that the people who actually live and work there reject his authority, if I can turn them against him, the legal framework becomes irrelevant. He sat across from her. Power is not just what the law says, it is what people are willing to enforce. If the workers, the tenants, the servants refuse to cooperate with Edmund, he has nothing, and I think they will refuse. Because they know me, they know what I built, and they know Edmund is using them as pawns. You are gambling that people will risk their livelihoods for you. I am gambling that people will risk their livelihoods for themselves. Edmund's version of Thornwood Park will be efficient, modernized and utterly devoid of the human considerations that made it sustainable. Within 6 months, he will have maximized profits and destroyed morale. I am simply accelerating the timeline, forcing the confrontation now before he can consolidate power. And if you are wrong, then I end up in prison or worse, and you rebuild your life without me. He reached across the table, took her hands. I will not ask you to come with me. This is beyond reckless. This is me walking into the fire because it is the only place Edmund cannot follow without revealing exactly what he is. She held his gaze for a long moment, then smiled. You are an idiot. A brilliant, stubborn, suicidal idiot. Of course I'm coming with you. They left London before dawn, traveling by hired coach because Alaric's own carriages had been seized with the estate. The journey took 6 hours, and with every mile Alaric felt the weight of what he was attempting settle deeper. This was not strategy. This was instinct.
The final gambit of someone who had run out of clever moves and resorted to raw confrontation. They arrived at Thornwood Park as the sun reached its zenith, winter light sharp and unforgiving. The estate looked unchanged from the outside, its limestone facade imposing and permanent, but Alaric knew appearances were deceiving. Inside, Edmund's people would be systematically dismantling everything Alaric had built, implementing new policies, asserting new authority, remaking the estate in Edmund's image. He walked through the main gates without hesitation. A guard stationed there looked up in shock. "Your Grace, you cannot be here. Lord Graves has issued orders." "I am aware of Lord Graves' orders. Inform him that I am in the east courtyard and will remain there until he has the courage to face me directly." The guard hesitated, then hurried off. Alaric stood in the courtyard, the place where he had addressed servants just days ago, and waited. Within minutes, people began to emerge from the various buildings. Servants, groundskeepers, stable workers, all of them drawn by word that the Duke had returned. Elowen stood beside him, her presence a statement of solidarity. The crowd grew, 50 people, then 100, forming a loose circle around them. And then Edmund appeared, flanked by Pembroke and the two enforcers who had been managing the estate in Alaric's absence. Edmund's face was a mask of controlled fury. "You are trespassing," he said. "Leave now, or I will have you removed forcibly." "This is my home," Alaric replied, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "You may have legal authority, but you do not have legitimacy. These people know the difference. These people are employed by the estate, which I now manage. They will follow my instructions or find themselves unemployed." Alaric turned to address the crowd. "Is that true? Will you follow a man who sees you as expendable? Who will maximize profits at your expense? Who will reduce you to line items on a balance sheet?" The crowd murmured, uncertain. Edmund seized the moment. "The Duke offers pretty words, but what has he actually given you? He has abandoned this estate, pursued personal gratification over duty, and now returns expecting loyalty he has not earned. I offer security, structure, and the promise that Thornwood Park will thrive under proper management." It was a strong counteroffer, and Alaric saw several people nodding. He needed to break through the fear, needed to give them something more tangible than principle. "You are right, Edmund," he said. "I abandoned the estate. I chose personal fulfillment over the crushing weight of duty that was slowly killing me. And in doing so, I discovered something. That the version of a Thornwood Park I built was sustainable precisely because it treated you as human beings rather than resources. Edmund's version will be more efficient, yes. It will also be hollow. Within months, you will understand what I mean. But by then, it will be too late." Thomas, the stable boy, stepped forward. "Your Grace, what are you asking us to do?" "I'm asking you to refuse cooperation. To make it clear that Edmund's authority exists on paper but not in reality. To strike, to resist, to demonstrate that power imposed without consent is simply tyranny with better paperwork." The courtyard erupted. Some shouted agreement, others objected. Many simply looked terrified. Edmund raised his voice. "Anyone who participates in this rebellion will be immediately terminated and evicted from estate housing. Your families will suffer. Your futures will be destroyed. Is that what you want?" Mrs. Fletcher, the head of housekeeping, spoke up. She was a woman in her 50s who had worked at Thornwood Park for 30 years. "With respect, Lord Graves, the Duke has never lied to us. He has been hard, yes. Demanding, yes. But fair. You come here with threats and call it management. I know which I prefer." Others began to voice agreement. The tide was shifting, not decisively, but enough to show that Edmund's control was not absolute. Edmund's composure cracked. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," he hissed at Alaric. "These people will suffer because of your ego." "No, Edmund. They will suffer because you're willing to use them as leverage. I'm giving them a choice. You're giving them an ultimatum. Let us see which they respect more." Before Edmund could respond, a new complication arrived. 3 carriages pulled into the courtyard, and from them emerged government officials including Justice Hartwell and Colonel Staines, accompanied by armed constables. Hartwell stepped forward, his expression grim. "Duke Viramont, we have been authorized to place you under arrest pending formal charges of inciting civil unrest and violating the terms of the inquiry suspension." "On whose authority?" Alaric demanded. "The Home Secretary acting on reports that you are attempting to foment rebellion." He gestured to the constables. "Please, come peacefully." Alaric looked at Elowen. She nodded, understanding what came next.
No, he said. The courtyard went silent. Your Grace, Hartwell said carefully, resisting arrest will only make this worse.
It cannot get worse, Justice Hartwell. I am already facing prosecution on charges I cannot defend, stripped of my home and title, reduced to a fugitive in the very place I spent decades protecting. So no, I will not come peacefully. If you want to arrest me, you will do it in front of these people. You will show them exactly how power operates when challenged, and you will live with the consequences of that image. It was the final gambit, turning the arrest into theater, forcing the government to either back down or reveal the violence inherent in its authority. Colonel Staines stepped forward. Constables, take him into custody. The constables moved toward Alaric, and then something unexpected happened. The crowd surged forward, not violently, but deliberately, forming a human barrier between Alaric and the authorities. Mrs. Fletcher stood at the front, arms crossed. You will have to go through us, she said quietly. Stand aside, Staines ordered. This is a lawful arrest.
Then make it lawful, someone shouted from the back.
Explain why defending yourself against corruption is a crime. The constables hesitated. This was not a situation their training had prepared them for. A crowd willing to non-violently resist, turning the arrest into a spectacle that would be reported in every newspaper by evening. Hartwell looked at Edmund. This is your doing. You pushed too hard, too fast. Edmund's face was white with fury. Arrest them all. Conspiracy, obstruction, whatever charges apply. Make an example. But Hartwell shook his head. No. This has spiraled beyond what I am willing to authorize. He turned to Alaric. You have 48 hours to surrender yourself voluntarily. If you do not, we will return with sufficient force to ensure compliance. Use that time wisely. The officials withdrew, leaving the courtyard in stunned silence. Edmund stood alone, his coalition fractured, his authority challenged, his careful plans in ruins. He looked at Alaric with something approaching hatred. This is not over. I know, Alaric replied. But now it happens on terms we both understand. No more procedure, no more pretense. Just two men and the question of who wants it more. Edmund left without another word. The crowd dispersed slowly, people returning to work or housing, but carrying with them the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. Elowen turned to Alaric. 48 hours. What do we do? We prepare for the endgame, because Edmund will not wait that long. He will come tonight, with everything he has, and this ends one way or another. They spent the remaining daylight hours fortifying their position, not physically, but strategically. Alaric met with key staff, outlined what was coming, and gave them the choice to leave or stay. Most stayed. He sent messages to journalists, ensuring that whatever happened next would be witnessed and recorded. He reached out to Lady Marguerite, asking her to use her influence to protect those who sided with him if things went badly. And as night fell over Thornwood Park, Alaric Vieremont stood in the courtyard where he had given his first orders as Duke, where he had imposed discipline and structure and control for 20 years, and waited for the final confrontation that would determine whether he had built something worth saving or simply delayed inevitable collapse. Elowen stood beside him. The fires are lit, she said quietly. What? Throughout the estate, workers have lit fires in the courtyards, the gardens, everywhere. They are signaling that they stand with you. Alaric looked around and saw it was true. Dozens of small fires burned across Thornwood Park, points of light in the darkness, and around each one stood people who had chosen resistance over safety. Then we make this count, he said. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses. Many horses, moving fast. Edmund was coming, and he was not coming alone. Alaric drew a breath, felt Elowen's hand slip into his, and faced the darkness where torches were beginning to appear like an advancing army. The final battle for Thornwood Park, for legitimacy, for the right to define what power meant and who deserved to wield it, was about to begin. And there, in the frozen courtyard, with fires burning and an empire hanging in the balance, Alaric Vieremont smiled, because for the first time in his life, he was fighting for something that mattered more than victory. He was fighting to remain human. The torches came first, floating points of flame in the winter darkness, advancing like fallen stars dragged across the earth. Edmund rode at the head of the column, flanked by hired men whose faces carried the blunt indifference of those paid to enforce rather than question. Behind them came carriages bearing witnesses, members of the council, journalists Edmund had cultivated, officials whose presence was meant to lend legitimacy to whatever violence was about to unfold. This was not merely confrontation. This was execution dressed as law enforcement, theater designed to break Alaric's resistance by demonstrating the futility of defiance. Alaric stood in the courtyard surrounded by fires that turned the night into something primal and uncertain. Around him gathered perhaps 200 people, servants, tenants, workers who had chosen to stand against the machinery of authority, not because they believed they would win, but because the alternative was accepting that their lives were currency to be spent by those who saw them as expendable. There's something profound that happens when human beings decide that dignity matters more than safety, when they look at power and refuse to grant it the deference it demands. They become dangerous in ways no amount of force can fully contain, because they have already made peace with the worst consequences and found themselves willing to pay the cost. The column halted 50 feet from the courtyard's edge. Edmund dismounted with theatrical precision, his movements calculated to project authority. He walked forward alone, stopping at the line where firelight met darkness, and addressed Alaric across the distance. "This is your final opportunity to surrender peacefully," he said, his voice carrying in the cold air. "Come with me now. Face the charges like a man of honor, and I will ensure those who followed you are treated with leniency. Continue this madness, and I will have no choice but to use force to restore order." Alaric stepped forward to meet him at the boundary. They stood facing each other like generals on a battlefield, each representing something larger than themselves. Edmund, the system that demanded conformity through accumulated pressure. Alaric, the individual who had finally decided that conformity was a price he would no longer pay. "You speak of honor as if it is a shield for what you are about to do," Alaric said quietly. "But we both know this has nothing to do with law or duty. This is you using violence to eliminate someone who threatens the comfortable fiction that power and legitimacy are the same thing. They are the same thing." Edmund's voice hardened. "Power without legitimacy is chaos. Legitimacy without power is irrelevant. I have both. You have neither. That is the only truth that matters. No, cousin. You have authority derived from manipulation and blackmail. I have loyalty earned through 20 years of living among these people, making decisions that affected their lives, and accepting that their welfare mattered more than my comfort. Those are different foundations. Yours is stone and paper. Mine is human connection. And when pressure comes, one shatters while the other bends. Then let us test which is which." Edmund turned to the hired enforcers. "Clear the courtyard. Anyone who resists will be charged with insurrection." The men moved forward, batons drawn, their approach methodical and impersonal. The crowd tightened around Alaric and Elowen, not aggressively but deliberately, bodies forming a barrier that would require violence to breach. And in that moment, something shifted in the calculation. The enforcers were professionals accustomed to scattering protesters and managing unruly crowds, but this was different. These were not faceless agitators. These were people with names, families, histories, people whose faces they would remember afterward, whose blood would stain more than just the ground. The lead enforcer stopped 10 feet away. "Lord Graves," he said carefully, "we were hired to manage civil disturbances, not to assault unarmed civilians. If you want this done, you will need to clarify the terms of engagement." Edmund's jaw tightened. "I am clarifying them now. Remove anyone blocking access to the Duke. Use whatever force is necessary." The enforcer glanced at his companions, saw the same hesitation mirrored there. "With respect, we are not executing a massacre for any amount of money. You want them moved. You find people willing to do that work." They withdrew to the column, their refusal a crack in Edmund's facade. He stood alone at the edge of firelight, and for the first time uncertainty flickered across his features. This was not how it was supposed to unfold. The presence of witnesses, the hired force, the legal framework, all of it was meant to make resistance impossible by demonstrating the overwhelming machinery of authority. But the machinery was refusing to function, and without it, Edmund was just a man standing in the dark, making demands no one was obligated to obey. "Then I will do it myself," Edmund said. He pulled a pistol from his coat, old-fashioned but functional, and aimed it at Alaric. "If I must personally restore order, so be it." The courtyard went silent. Even the fires seemed to still. Elowen moved to step in front of Alaric, but he held her back, his hand firm on her arm. His eyes never left Edmund's face. "Do it," Alaric said quietly. "Pull the trigger. Prove to everyone here that your authority rests on nothing more than the willingness to murder someone who refuses to submit. Make them all witnesses to what power looks like when stripped of every justification except force. Edmund's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the terrible understanding that he had been outmaneuvered one final time. If he fired, he was a killer. If he did not, he was impotent. Either outcome destroyed him. The witnesses would report what they saw, the journalists would write what they witnessed, and the narrative would slip completely beyond his control. You have spent your entire life building to this moment, Alaric continued, his voice steady and surgical. You have maneuvered, manipulated, sacrificed every relationship and principle to reach a position where you could take what you believed you deserved. And now you stand here with a gun pointed at an unarmed man, surrounded by people watching you decide whether your ambition is worth becoming a murderer. So make the choice, Edmund. Show us who you really are beneath the veneer of civilization and reform. The gun wavered. Edmund's breathing was ragged, his composure shattered by the simple reality that everything he had built depended on others enabling him, and the enabling had stopped. Without the enforcers, without the council's backing, without the machinery of legitimacy he had so carefully constructed, he was just a man with a weapon and nowhere to go that did not end in ruin. Behind him, one of the journalists spoke up. Lord Graves, I would advise lowering the weapon. Whatever your grievances, this has escalated beyond any reasonable— Shut up, Edmund hissed. All of you, shut up and let me think. But there was nothing to think about. The trap he had built for Alaric had become his own cage. He lowered the gun slowly, his hand shaking, and the defeat in that gesture was absolute. Alaric walked forward, crossing the boundary into darkness, until he stood directly in front of Edmund. He reached out and took the pistol from his cousin's unresisting hand. This is what power actually looks like, Alaric said quietly, his voice meant only for Edmund. Not the ability to force submission, but the courage to stand in the fire and trust that what you have built with people matters more than what you can impose on them. You never understood that. You thought control was strength. It is only ever fear. He turned and walked back to the courtyard, leaving Edmund standing alone. The journalists were already writing, the witnesses already forming narratives that would reach London by morning. Edmund Graves had lost, not through superior strategy or legal maneuvering, but through the simple erosion of every pillar he had built his authority upon. But the night was not finished. From the shadows beyond the column emerged another figure, one Alaric had not expected to see again. Catherine, his wife, his ghost, wrapped in a dark cloak and carrying the weight of 19 years in her expression. She walked past Edmund without acknowledging him, entered the courtyard, and stopped in front of Alaric. The crowd parted to give them space, sensing that this confrontation belonged to a different category of conflict. I came to end this, Catherine said. Her voice was tired, worn by decisions and regrets. Edmund used me to hurt you, and I allowed it because I was afraid. But I'm done being afraid. She produced documents from inside her cloak. Legal papers, signed and notarized. I have filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment and fraud. The marriage is dissolved, effective immediately. You are free, Alaric. Free to build whatever life you choose without the chains I put on you 20 years ago. Alaric took the papers, scanned them, and felt something heavy lift from his chest. Why now? Because I finally realized that running from hard things does not make them disappear. It just makes you smaller. She looked at Elowen. I do not know you, Miss Hart, but I know what it costs to stand beside someone the world condemns. You have more courage than I ever did. Use it well. She turned to leave, then paused. Alaric, I am sorry. For the lie, for the cowardice, for every year you spent believing in a death that was really just my failure, to be honest. I cannot undo it, but I can stop adding to it. You are free too, Catherine. Free to stop apologizing for choosing yourself. She nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips, and walked back into the darkness. Edmund watched her pass without speaking, his defeat now complete. He had lost the estate, lost his credibility, and lost the only leverage he had believed unassailable. The column began to withdraw, the witnesses and officials returning to their carriages, the journalists eager to file stories that would dominate headlines for weeks. Edmund remained standing alone until finally, with nothing left to say, he too turned and left, his figure swallowed by darkness. The courtyard erupted in cautious celebration. People embraced, laughed with the release of tension, allowed themselves to believe that perhaps resistance had not been futile after all. Alaric stood at the center of it, feeling the weight of victory settle over him, and discovered it was not the triumph he had imagined. There was relief, yes. There was satisfaction in having survived. But there was also the exhaustion of someone who had fought so hard for so long that he no longer remembered what peace felt like. Elowen found him at the edge of the firelight, staring at Thornwood Park's facade. "You won," she said. "Did I?" He gestured at the estate. "Edmund is gone, but so is everything I built. The council will never accept me back. The government will find new charges when the political winds shift. I have freedom, but I have traded an empire for it. Is that a bad trade? I do not know yet." He looked at her. "I spent 20 years making myself indispensable to this place, and in the end, it dispensed with me the moment I became inconvenient. Maybe that is the lesson, that no one is truly indispensable, and building your identity around being needed by institutions is just another form of prison. So what do we do now? Now we rebuild. Not Thornwood Park. That belongs to whoever comes next. We build something smaller, something that does not require sacrificing ourselves to maintain it, something human-sized." The next weeks were a blur of transition and transformation. Lady Marguerite used her influence to ensure the workers who had stood with Alaric were protected from retaliation. The journalists' accounts of Edmund's collapse sparked investigations into his financial dealings, his manipulation of government processes, and his blackmail of Catherine. Within a month, Edmund Graves had resigned from public life entirely, his reputation destroyed and his ambitions reduced to cautionary tales. The council appointed a neutral administrator to manage Thornwood Park until a new duke could be confirmed through the proper legal channels. Alaric was offered the opportunity to reclaim his title if he agreed to certain restrictions and oversight. He declined. The title had been a cage disguised as honor, and he had no interest in returning to it. Instead, he and Elowen moved to a modest house in the countryside, far enough from London to escape constant scrutiny, but close enough to remain connected to the few people who mattered. It was a fraction of the size of Thornwood Park, with no servants, no grandeur, no markers of status. Just 4 rooms, a garden, and the unprecedented luxury of privacy. Alaric discovered that he had no idea how to live without structure imposed from outside. For weeks, he wandered the small house like a ghost, uncertain what to do with days that had no meetings, no obligations, no crises demanding resolution. Elowen watched him struggle and finally intervened. "You are mourning," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Not for what you lost, but for who you were. That man was forged in war and duty, and the belief that control was survival. He served you well for a long time, but he is gone now, and you need to decide who you are without him. I do not know how to be anyone else. Then learn. Make mistakes, waste time, do things badly. You spent decades being competent at everything. Try being incompetent at something new. It is strangely liberating." So he tried. He learned to cook, badly at first, burning more meals than he served. He read books that had nothing to do with strategy or politics, losing himself in novels and philosophy and histories of people who had lived and died without leaving empires behind. He worked in the garden, getting dirt under his fingernails and learning the slow rhythms of growth that could not be rushed or controlled. And slowly, incrementally, he began to understand what it meant to simply be rather than constantly achieve. There was a poverty to it compared to his former life, less influence, less importance, less certainty that he mattered in the grand scheme of things. But there was also a richness he had never experienced, a depth of connection that came from building a life around one person rather than managing an estate of hundreds. Elowen thrived in the small house. She wrote essays on political economy that were published in reformist journals, her ideas gaining traction in circles Alaric had never penetrated. She corresponded with labor organizers and policy advocates, her network growing not through inherited status, but through the quality of her thinking. Watching her flourish, Alaric understood that he had not saved her from anything. She had saved him from the slow death of living for nothing but obligation. Lady Marguerite visited often, her sharp wit undimmed by age. She delighted in the transformation, teasing Alaric mercilessly about his reduced circumstances. "Look at you," she said during one visit, "covered in garden soil and flour from baking, from duke to domestic peasant. Your parents would be horrified." "Good," Alaric replied. "They spent their entire lives horrified by anything that deviated from proper form. I am done living to avoid horrifying people." Wise words. She sipped her tea. Though I must say, you are better at being happy than I expected. I thought you would spiral into existential despair without an empire to manage.
I thought so too. But it turns out that meaning is not something you impose on the world through force of will. It is something you discover in the spaces between ambition and survival. In the mornings when I wake up beside someone who knows everything about me and chooses to stay. In the evenings when we argue about ideas instead of managing crises. In the small victories of getting bread to rise properly on the third attempt.
Marguerite smiled. You have become philosophical in your retirement. I have become human. It took 42 years and losing everything, but I finally managed it.
6 months after leaving Thornwood Park, Alaric received an unexpected letter. It was from Thomas, the stable boy he had protected, now working as an apprentice to the new estate administrator. The letter was brief but carried weight beyond its words.
Your Grace, it read, the estate has changed since you left. The new administrator is efficient but cold. He sees everything as numbers on ledgers, people as resources to be optimized. We are more productive than ever and more miserable. I wanted you to know that what you built mattered. Not the efficiency or the profits, but the sense that someone at the top saw us as human beings worth consideration. That is gone now, and we feel the absence every day. I do not know if this brings you comfort or pain, but I thought you should know. The world you tried to build was worth building, even if it could not survive contact with people who did not share your vision. Alaric read the letter 3 times, sitting in the garden as dusk settled over the countryside. Elowen found him there, the paper still in his hands. Bad news? She asked.
The opposite. Proof that the fight mattered, even if we lost in the traditional sense. He handed her the letter. I spent so many years believing that success meant permanence, that if I built something strong enough, it would outlast me. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the point was to demonstrate that a different way was possible, even temporarily, and let that possibility live in people's minds as an alternative to the grinding machinery they are told to accept. You are giving yourself too much credit. One person cannot change systems. No. But one person can show others that the system is not inevitable, that there are choices, even when power insists there are none, and enough people making those choices, refusing to grant authority. The obedience it demands can crack foundations that seemed permanent. They sat in silence as darkness fell, the garden alive with sounds of insects and wind through trees. Inside, a life waited that was small and unremarkable by the measures Alaric had once used to judge worth. But it was genuine in ways his previous existence had never been, built on foundation of chosen connection rather than inherited obligation. The final reckoning came on a cold morning in early spring, when Alaric received notice that the legal proceedings against him had been formally dropped. The government had concluded that pursuing charges would be more damaging than letting the matter fade, that the publicity had made Alaric a symbol whose prosecution would raise uncomfortable questions about institutional overreach. He was free, not through victory in court, but through the calculus of political convenience. Elowen found him reading the notice, his expression unreadable. Is this supposed to feel triumphant? He asked. Is that what it feels like? No, it feels anticlimactic. Like they are granting permission for something I already took. He set the papers aside. I think that is the final lesson. That freedom is not something institutions bestow. It is something you claim by refusing to accept that they have the right to withhold it. And if they punish you for claiming it, then you decide whether the punishment is worse than the cage. For me, it was not. Even at the worst moments, even when I thought I would lose everything, I was more alive than I had been in 20 years of compliance. She kissed him, slow and deliberate, a statement that had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with recognition. We built something, she said, not an empire, not a legacy, just a life that belongs to us instead of the systems that tried to define us. That is victory enough. And it was. In the months and years that followed, Alaric and Elowen built an existence that would never appear in history books or be studied by future generations. They were simply two people who had refused the scripts written for them and improvised something new from the wreckage of expectations. They were not famous. They were not powerful. They were not the people they had been told they must become. They were free. Alaric Viermont had been forged in war, tempered by duty, and nearly destroyed by the belief that control was the only alternative to chaos. But in losing everything he thought defined him, He discovered something more valuable, that dominance was not strength, that vulnerability was not weakness, and that the truest form of power was the courage to stand in the ruins of what you built and choose connection over conquest. The estate he left behind would be managed by others, more efficiently perhaps, with better profit margins and optimized systems. But it would never again carry the soul of someone who saw the people within it as more than functions to be managed. That vision died with his departure, and perhaps that was inevitable. Systems revert to their natures when the pressure to be better is removed. They optimize for survival and efficiency, not humanity. But the people who had witnessed the alternative carried that memory forward. In small ways, in private choices, in moments when they refused to accept that cruelty was necessary or that people were expendable, they kept alive the possibility that there could be another way. And possibilities, once planted, have a tendency to grow in unexpected directions. On quiet evenings, Alaric and Elowen would sit by the fire and talk about the future they were building. Not grand plans or ambitious schemes, but simple things. Maybe they would travel. See parts of the world Alaric had only known as battle maps and strategic objectives. Maybe they would write, documenting what they had learned about power and humanity and the cost of choosing one's own path. Maybe they would do nothing particularly notable at all, and that would be enough. Because here's what Alaric had finally learned. This man who had commanded armies and governed estates and believed that being indispensable was the highest achievement, that mattering to one person completely was worth more than being vaguely important to thousands, that building a life around genuine connection required more courage than building an empire through force of will, that the measure of a man was not what he controlled, but what he was willing to sacrifice control to protect. He had been the Duke of Thornwood, a title that carried weight and demanded deference and ultimately meant nothing when stripped of the institutions that enforced it. Now he was simply Alaric, a man with a small house, and a woman who knew his darkest moments and loved him not despite them, but because he had finally stopped hiding them. And in the end, that transformation, from monument to human being, from controller to partner, from fortress to open door, was the only legacy that mattered. The fires that had burned in Thornwood Park's courtyard on that final night had been more than illumination. They had been signal fires, announcements that people were willing to stand against the machinery of authority when it demanded too much. Most of those fires had been extinguished. The people who lit them returned to their lives, the moment of resistance fading into memory. But some fires never go out. They burn in the hearts of people who saw what was possible, who witnessed someone choosing principle over survival and somehow surviving anyway. They burn in the quiet refusal to grant power more authority than it has earned. They burn in the understanding that systems are only permanent until enough people decide they are not. Alaric and Elowen tended their own fire now, in a hearth that warmed a home instead of an empire. And on the mantle above that hearth, Alaric had placed a single item from his former life, the photograph of his parents that he had taken when he fled Thornwood Park. Not because he wanted to remember them fondly, he did not, but because he wanted to remember what happened when you built your entire existence around meeting expectations set by people who never questioned whether those expectations were worth meeting. His father had been Duke before him, stern and uncompromising and utterly empty. His mother had been the perfect aristocrat, beautiful and cold and desperately unhappy. They had lived their entire lives in service to a system that promised meaning through hierarchy and delivered only hollow performance. And they had died believing they had succeeded, never understanding that success measured by such metrics was just elaborate failure. Alaric would not make that mistake. He had failed by every measure his parents would have recognized, lost his title, lost his estate, lost the respect of the world that mattered to them. And in that failure, he had found the only success worth having, a life lived on his own terms, built with someone who saw him as a person rather than a function, and defined by choices he made rather than obligations he inherited. As spring deepened into summer, Alaric worked in the garden, his hands in the soil, his mind finally quiet. Elowen sat on the porch reading, occasionally glancing up to watch him with an expression that carried no agenda beyond simple appreciation. They had survived the storm. They had built something new from the wreckage. They had proved that it was possible to choose differently and live with the consequences without being destroyed. That was the story Alaric Viramont would have told if anyone asked, which they rarely did, because the world that had once found him fascinating had moved on to new dramas and different scandals. Edmund Graves had become a cautionary tale whispered in political circles. Thornwood Park had become just another estate under new management,
And the Duke who chose a servant over an empire had become a footnote, briefly interesting and ultimately irrelevant.
Which was exactly what Alaric wanted. Irrelevance, he had discovered, was another word for freedom. The freedom to matter to the people you chose instead of the institutions that demanded your service. The freedom to fail without destroying yourself in the process. The freedom to be small and human and imperfect without constantly performing competence for an audience that would never be satisfied. He had been many things in his life: soldier, administrator, duke, exile. But the role he inhabited now was the only one that felt true: partner, learner. Man still figuring out how to live without armor. It was harder than any battle he had fought, required more courage than any strategic gambit, and delivered satisfaction deeper than any victory he had achieved through dominance. As the sun set over their small house, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Alaric Viramont stood in his garden and felt something he had not experienced in 20 years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose chosen rather than imposed. Not the silence of control, but the harmony of collaboration. Not the cold satisfaction of conquest, but the warm reality of connection. He had lost an empire and gained a life. And in the final accounting, measured against the only standard that mattered, whether he could look at himself without flinching, it was the best trade he had ever made. The Duke was dead. Long live the man.